Chapter 13 of The First Sir Percy. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The First Sir Percy by Baroness Orczy. Chapter 13. The Stygian Creek. Part 1. The Lord of Stoutenburg was conscious of a great feeling of relief when the blind man was finally removed from his presence. While the latter stood there, even in the abjectness of his plight, Stoutenburg felt that he was a living menace to the success of all his well-thought-out schemes. He kept his eyes fixed on Gilda with a warning look that should be a reminder to her of the immutability of his resolve. He tried, in a manner, to surround her with a compelling fluid that would engulf her resistance and leave her weak and passive to his will. There was of necessity a vast amount of confusion and din ere order was restored among the debris, and conversation was impossible in the midst of the clatter that was going on. Men coming and going, the rattle of silver and glass. Gilda the while sat quite still, her blue eyes fixed with strange intensity on the door through which her beloved had disappeared. Her father stood beside her, holding her hand, and she rested her cheek against his. The burgomaster, throughout the last scene, had not once looked at Diogenes. A dark, puzzled frown lingered between his brows whilst he stared moodily into the fire. He absolutely ignored the presence of his son, putting into practice his stern dictum that henceforth he had no son, whilst Nicholas, who was becoming inured to his shameful position, put on a careless and jaunty air, spoke with easy familiarity to Stoutenburg and peremptorily to the men. Then at last the table was once more set, the candles relit, and the board again spread for supper. Stoutenburg, with an elegant flourish, invited his guests to sit, offered his arm to Gilda to lead her to the table. She, moved by a pathetic desire to conciliate him, a forlorn hope that a great show of submission on her part would soften his cruel heart and lighten the fate of her beloved, placed her hand upon his sleeve, and when she met his admiring glance, a slight flush drove the pallor from her cheek. "You are adorable, mein Geloof," he murmured. He appeared highly elated, sat at the head of the table with Gilda on his right and the burgomaster on his left, whilst Nicholas sat beside his sister. The two old crones served the supper, coming and going with the noiselessness and precision acquired in long service in the well-conducted house of the burgomaster. They knew the use of the two-pronged silver utensils which Mynheer Beresteyn had acquired of late direct from France, where they were used at the table of gentlemen of quality for conveying food to the mouth. They knew how to remove each service from the centre of the table without unduly disturbing the guests, and how to replace one cloth with another the moment it became soiled with sauce or wine. Jan stood at the Lord of Stoutenburg's elbow and served him personally and with his own hands. Every dish, before it was handed to his lordship, was placed in front of the burgomaster, who was curtly bidden to taste of it. His magnificence, adept in the poisoner's art, was taking no risks himself. The cook had done his best, and the supper was, I believe, excellent. The oil, the most succulent of dishes, made up of quails, capons, and ducks, and other tasty meats, was a marvel of gastronomic art, and so were the tureenes of beef with cucumber and the breast of veal larded and garnished with hard-boiled eggs. In truth, it was all a terrible waste, and sad to see such excellent fare laid before guests who hardly would touch a morsel. Gilda could not eat. Her throat seemed to close up every time she tried to swallow. Indeed, she had to appeal to the very last shred of her pride to keep up a semblance of dignity before her enemy. The burgomaster, too, flushed with shame at the indignity put upon him, did no more than taste of the dishes as they were put before him by the surly Jan. The Lord of Stoutenburg, on the other hand, put up a great show of hilarity, talked much and drank deeply, discussed in a loud, arrogant voice with Nicholas the Archduchess's plans for the subduing of the Netherlands, And Nicholas, after he had imbibed 2 or 3 bumpers of heady Spanish wine, felt more assured, returned Gilda's reproachful glances with indifference, and his father's contempt with defiance. Part 2. What Gilda suffered it were a vain attempt to describe. How she contrived to remain at the table, to appear indifferent, almost gay, to glance up now and again at a persuasive challenge from Stoutenburg, will forever remain her secret. She never spoke of that hour, of that hateful, harrowing supper, like an odious nightmare, which was wont in after years to send a shudder of horror right through her whenever she recalled it. The burgomaster remained at first obstinately silent, whilst the Lord of Stoutenburg talked with studied insolence of the future of the Netherlands. The happy times would now come back, the traitor vowed, when the United Provinces, dissolved into feeble and separate entities, without form or governance, would once more return to their allegiance and bow the knee before the might of Spain, when the wholesome rule of another Alva would teach these stiff-necked and presumptuous burghers that comfort and a measure of welfare could only be obtained by unconditional surrender and submission to a high unconquerable power. "Freedom, liberty," he sneered. "Ancient charters, bah! Empty swaggering words, I say, which their masters will soon force them to swallow. Then will follow an era more suited to all this beggarly Dutch rabble, one that will teach them a lesson which will at last stick in their memories. The hangman, that's what they want. The stake, the rack, our glorious Inquisition, and the relentlessness which, alas, for the nonce hath lain buried with our immortal Alva." He drank a loyal toast to the coming new era, to the Archduchess, to King Philip IV, who in his glorious reign would see Spain once more unconquered, the Netherlands subdued, England punished at last. Nicholas joined him with many a lustful shout, whilst the burgomaster sat with set lips, his eyes glowing with suppressed indignation. Once or twice it seemed as if his stern self-control would give way, as if his burning wrath would betray him into words and deeds that might cause abysmal misery to hundreds of innocent people, whilst not serving in any way the cause which he would have given his life to uphold. Indeed, in the book of heroic deeds, of which God's angel hath a record, none stand out more brilliantly than the endurance of the burgomaster of Amersfoort and of his daughter on this memorable occasion. Nor is there in the whole valorous history of the Netherlands a more glorious page than that which tells of the sacrifice made by father and daughter in order to save the city which they loved from threatened annihilation. Part 3. But like all things good and evil, the trial came to an end at last. The Lord of Stoutenburg gave the signal, and the burgomaster and Gilda rose from the table both, in truth, with a deep sigh of thankfulness. Stoutenburg remained deferential until the end, deferential, that is, with an undercurrent of mockery, which he took no pains to conceal. His bow, as he finally took leave of his guests, bidding the burgomaster a simple farewell, and Gilda au revoir until the dawn on the morrow, was so obviously ironical that Beresteyn was goaded into an indignant tirade, which he regretted almost as soon as he had uttered it. "Let him who stands," he said firmly, and with all of his wonted dignity, "take heed lest he fall. The Netherlands are not conquered yet, my lord, because your mercenary troops have succeeded, for the time being, in overrunning one of her provinces. Ada may have fallen, Amersfoort may for the moment be under your heel, Arnheim and Nijmegen may have capitulated by now," Stoutenburg broke in derisively. "Sold to de Burg, like Amersfoort and Ada, by the craven Smeerlap to whom you have given your daughter." "Even that may have happened," the burgomaster riposted hotly, "if so be the will of God. But we are a race of fighters. We have beaten and humiliated the Spaniard and driven him from off our land before now. And Maurice of Nassau, the finest captain of the age, is unconquered still." "Mightily sick, so I'm told," the other put in carelessly. "He was over-ready, methinks, to abandon Amersfoort to its fate. Only to punish you more effectually in the end. Take heed, my lord, take heed. The multiplicity of your crimes will find you out soon enough." "Splud," retorted Stoutenburg unperturbed. "But you forget, Mynheer Burgomaster, that, whate'er betide me, your daughter's fate is henceforth linked to mine own." Then it was that Beresteyn repented of his outburst, for indeed he had gained nothing by it, and Stoutenburg had used the one argument which was bound to silence him. What in truth was the use of wrangling? Dignity was sure to suffer, and that mocking recreant would only feel that his triumph was more complete. Even now he only laughed, pointed with an ironical flourish of his arm to the widely open doors, through which, in the dimly lighted hall, a group of men could be perceived, sitting or standing around the centre table, with Diogenes standing in their midst, his fair head crowned by the hideous bandage, and his broad shoulders towering above the puny, swarthy Spanish soldiery. He had a mug of ale in his hand, and holding it aloft, he was singing a ribald song, the refrain of which was taken up by the men. In the vague and flickering light of resin torches, his sightless orbs looked spectral, like those of a wraith. "You should be grateful to me, Mynheer," Stoutenburg added with a sneer, "for freeing your daughter from such a yoke." He returned to Gilda, took her unresisting hand, and raised it to his lips. Above it, he was watching her face. She was looking beyond him, straight at the blind man, and though Stoutenburg at that moment would have bartered much for the knowledge of what was in her thoughts, he could not define the expression of her eyes. At one time he thought that they softened, that the fulfillment of all his hopes was hanging once more in the balance. It seemed for the moment as if she would snatch away her hand and seek shelter, as she had done before, against the heart of her beloved, that right through that outer husk of misery and degradation she saw something that puzzled her rather than repelled. A question seemed to be hovering on her lips, a question of a protest, or was it a mute appeal for forgiveness? Stoutenburg could not tell, but he felt that for a space of a few seconds the whole edifice of his desires was tottering, that fate might after all still be holding a thunderbolt in store for him, which would hurl him down from the pinnacle of this momentary triumph. Gilda, as a woman, was still unconquered. Neither her heart nor her soul would ever be his. Somehow it was the glance wherewith she regarded the blind man that told the Lord of Stoutenburg this one unalterable fact. The sortilege which he had tried to evoke by letting her look on the pitiful wreck who had once been her lover had fallen short in its potent charm. His own brilliant prospects, his masterful personality, aye, his well-assumed indifference, had all failed to cast their spells over her. Unlike the valiant Petruchio of the English play, he had not yet succeeded in taming this beautiful shrew. In the past she had resisted his blandishments. If she succumbed at all, it would be beneath the weight of his tyranny. Well, so be it. Nicholas, no doubt, had been right when he said that women reserved their disdain for weaklings. It was the man of iron who won a woman's love. The thought sent a fierce glow of hatred coursing through his blood. Mythical and fatalistic as he was, he believed that his lucky star would only begin to rise when he had succeeded in winning Gilda for his own. He had deemed women an easy conquest in the past. This one could not resist him for long. Even men were wont to come readily under his sway. Witness Nicholas Beresteyn, who was as wax in his hands. In the past, he had delighted in wielding a kind of cabalistic power, which he undoubtedly possessed, over many a weak or shifty character. His mother even was wont to call him a magician, and stood not a little in awe of the dark-visaged, headstrong child, and later on of the despotic, lawless youth who had set the crown on her manifold sorrows by his callousness and his crimes. That power had been on the wane of late, but it could not be gone from him forever. Nicholas was still his sycophant. Jan and his kind were still to go to death for him. His own brain had devised a means for bringing that obstinate burgomaster and the beautiful Gilda to their knees. Then, of a surety, in the cornucopia of fate, there was something more comforting, more desirable than a thunderbolt. Was not a man the master of his destiny? Bah! What was a woman's love after all? Why not let her go? Be content with worldly triumphs. The sacking of Amersfoort, which would yield him wealth and treasure, the gratitude of the Archduchess, a high, if not the highest, position in the reconquered provinces. Why not be content with those? And Stoutenburg groaned like a baffled tiger, because in his heart of hearts he knew these things would not content him in the end. He wanted Gilda of the blue eyes and the golden hair, the demure glance and fragrant hands. His desire for her was in his bones, and he felt that he would indeed go raving mad if he lost her after this. If that beggarly drunkard, unwashed, dishonoured, and stricken with blindness, triumphed through his very abasement and the magnitude of his misfortune. "This, at any rate, I can avert," he murmured under his breath, and somehow the thought eased the racking jealousy that was torturing him. Jealousy of such an abject thing. He waited until Gilda had passed out of the room, and when she was standing in the hall, so obviously bidding a last farewell in her heart to the man she loved so well, he called peremptorily to Jan. "Take the varlet," he commanded roughly, "and hang him on the cobbleport." At the word, Gilda turned on him like an infuriated tigress. Pushing past her father, past the men, who recoiled from her as if from a madwoman, she was back beside the execrable despot who thus put the crown on his hideous cruelties. "Your bargain, my lord!" she cried hoarsely. "You dare not! You dare not!" "My bargain, fair one?" Stoutenburg retorted coolly. "Nay, you are so averse to fulfilling your share of it that I have repented me of proposing it. The varlet hangs. That is my last word." His last word, and Jan so ready to obey. The men were already closing in around her beloved. Less than a minute later, they had his hands securely pinioned behind his back. Can you wonder that she lost her head? That she fought to free herself from her father's arms, and throwing reserve, dignity to the winds, threw herself at the feet of that inhuman monster, and pleaded with him as no woman on earth had, mayhap, ever pleaded before? We do not like to think of that exquisite, refined woman kneeling before such an abominable dastard. Yet she did it. Words of appeal, of entreaty, poured from her quivering lips. She raised her tear-stained face to his, embraced his knees with her arms. She forgot the men that stood by, puzzled and vaguely awed. Jan resolute, her father torn to the heart. She forgot everything save that there was a chance, a remote chance, of softening a cruel heart, and she could not, no, could not, see the man she loved dragged to shameful death before her eyes. She promised all that she had to give. "I'll be your willing slave, my lord, in all things," she pleaded, her voice broken and hoarse. "Your loving wife, as you desire. A kiss from me? Take it, and you will. I'll not resist. Nay, I'll return it from my heart in exchange for your clemency." Then it was that the burgomaster succeeded at last in tearing her away from her humiliating position. He dragged her to her feet, drew her to his breast, tried by words and admonition to revive in her sense of dignity and her self-control. Only with one word did he, in his turn, condescend to plead. "And you have a spark of humanity left in you, my lord," he said loudly. "Order your executioners to be quick about their business." For the Lord of Stoutenburg had, with a refinement of cruelty almost unbelievable were it not a matter of history, stayed Jan from executing his inhuman order. "Wait," his glittering eyes appeared to say to the sycophant henchman who hung upon his looks. "Let me enjoy this feast until I am satiated." Then, when Gilda lay at last, half swooning in the shelter of her father's arms, he said coolly, "Have I not said, fair one, that if you deign to plead the rascal should not hang? See, the potency of your charm upon my sensitive heart. The man who hath always been my most bitter enemy, and whom at last I have within my power, shall live because your fair arms did encircle my knees, and because of your free will you offered me a kiss. Mynheer Burgomaster," he added with easy condescension, "I pray you lead your daughter to her room. She is overwrought and hath need of rest. Go in peace, I pray you. That drunken varlet is safe now in my hands." The burgomaster could not trust himself to reply. Only his loving hands wandered with a gentle, soothing gesture over his beloved daughter's hair, whilst he murmured soft, endearing words in her ear. Gradually she became more calm, was able to gather her wits together, to realize what she had done and all that she had sacrificed, probably in vain. Stoutenburg had spoken soft words, but how could she trust him, who had ever proved himself a liar and a cheat? She was indeed like a miserable captive bird, held, maimed, and bruised, in a cruel trap set by vengeful and cunning hands. It seemed almost incredible why she should be made to suffer so. What had she done? In what horrible way had she sinned before God, that his hand should lie so heavily upon her? Even her sacrifice, sublime and selfless, failed to give her the consolation of duty nobly accomplished. Everything before her was dreary and dark. Life itself was naught but torture. The few days, hours, that must intervene until she knew that Amersfoort was safe confronted her like the dark passage into Gehenna. Beyond them lay death at last, and she, a young girl scarce out of adolescence, hitherto rich, beautiful, adulated, was left to long for that happy release from misery with an intensity of longing akin to the sighing of souls in torment. End of Chapter 13, read by Belinda McReynolds, Melbourne, 30th of April, 2024.
Chapter 14.1 of the First Sir Percy. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Wayne Hom. The First Sir Percy by Baroness Orczy. Chapter 14. Treachery. Part 1. Throughout this harrowing scene the blind man had stood by, pinioned, helpless, almost lifeless in his immobility. The only sign of life in him seemed to be in those weird, sightless orbs in which the flickering light of the resin torches appeared to draw shafts of an unearthly glow. He was pinioned and could not move. 6 soldiers had closed in around him. Whether he heard all that went on, many who were there at the time declared it to be doubtful. But even if he heard, what could he have done? He could not even put his hands up to his ears to shut out that awful sound of his beloved wife's hoarse, spent voice pleading desperately for him. One of the men who was on guard over him told de Foc afterwards that he could hear the tough sinews cracking against the bonds that held the giant captive, and that great drops of sweat appeared upon the fine, wide brow. When Gilda, leaning heavily upon her father's arm, finally mounted the stairs which led up to her room, the blind man turned his head in that direction. But the young Jungfrau went on with head bent, and did not glance down in response. All this we know from de Foc, who speaks of it in his Brieven. But he was not himself present on the scene, and hath it only from hearsay. He questioned several of the men subsequently as he came in contact with them, and, of course, the burgomaster's testimony was the most clear and the most detailed. Mynheer Beresteyn admitted that, throughout that awful, never-to-be-forgotten evening, he could not understand the blind man's attitude, was literally tortured with doubts of him. Was he, in truth, the craven wretch which he appeared to be, the miserable traitor who had sold the stadtholder's original plans to de Burgh, betrayed Marquette and de Keyser, and hopelessly jeopardized the whole of Gelderland, if not the entire future of the Netherlands? If so, he was well deserving of the horrible punishment which had already been meted out to him, well deserving of the gallows, which would not fail to be his lot. But was he? Was he? The face, of course, out of which the light of the eyes had vanished, was inscrutable. The mouth, remember, was partially hidden by the 3 days' growth of beard, and grime and fatigue had further obliterated all other marks of expression. Of course, the man must have suffered tortures of humiliation and rage, which would effectually deaden all physical pain. But at the time he seemed not to suffer. Indeed, at one moment it almost seemed as if he were asleep, with sightless eyes wide open and standing on his feet. Part 2. After Gilda and her father had disappeared on the floor above, the Lord of Stoutenburg, like a wild and caged beast awaiting satisfaction, began pacing up and down the long banqueting hall. The doors leading into it from the hall had been left wide open, and the men could see his lordship in his restless wanderings, his heavy boots ringing against the reed-covered floor. He held his arms folded across his chest, and was gnawing, yes, gnawing, his knuckles in the excess of his excitement and his choler. Then he called Jan, and parleyed with him for a while, consulted Mynheer Nicholas, who was more taciturn and gloomy than ever before. The soldiers knew what was coming. They had witnessed the scene between the Jongejuffrouw and his magnificence, and some of them who had wives and sweethearts of their own had felt uncomfortable lumps at the time in their throats. Others who had sons fell to wishing that their offsprings might be as finely built, as powerful as that poor, blind, intoxicated wretch who, in truth, now had no use for his magnificent muscles. But what would you? These were troublous times. Life was cheap, counted for nothing in the sight of such great gentlemen as was the Lord of Stoutenburg. The varlet, it seems, had offended his lordship a while ago. Jan knew the story, and was very bitter about it too. Well, no man could expect to be treated with gentleness by a great lord whom he had been fool enough to offend. The blind rascallion would hang, of that there could be no doubt. The Jongejuffrouw had been pacified with soft words and vague promises, but the rascal would hang. Any man there would have bet his shirt on that issue. You had only to look at his lordship. A more determined, more terrifying look it were impossible to meet. Even Jan looked a little scared. When his magnificence looked like that, it boded no good to anyone. All the rancor, the gall, that had accumulated in his heart against everything that pertained to the United Provinces and to their stadtholder would effectively smother the slightest stirring of conscience or pity. Perhaps, when the Jongejuffrouw knelt at his feet, he had thought of his mother, who, equally distraught and equally humiliated, had knelt equally in vain at the stadtholder's feet, pleading for the life of her sons. Oh yes, all that had made the Lord of Stoutenburg terribly hard and callous. But the men were sorry for the blind vagabond for all that. He had had nothing to do with the feuds between the stadtholder and the sons of Oldenbarnevelt. He had done nothing, seemingly, save to win the love of the beautiful lady whom his magnificence had marked for his own. He was brave, too. You could not help admiring him as he stood between you and your comrades, his head thrown back, a splendid type of virility and manhood. Half seas over he may have been. His misfortunes were, in truth, enough to make any man take a drink. But you could not help but see that there was an air of spirituality about the forehead and the sensitive nostrils which redeemed the face from any suggestion of sensuality. And now and again a quaint smile would play round the corners of his mouth, and the whole wan face would light up as if with a sudden whimsical thought. Then all at once he threw back his head and yawned. Such a droll fellow, yawning on the brink of eternity. It was, in truth, a pity he should hang. Part 3. Yes, the blind man yawned, loudly and long, like one who is ready for bed. And the harmless sound completed Stoutenburg's exasperation. He once more gave the harsh word of command, "Take the varlet out and hang him." Obviously this time it would be irrevocable. There was no one here to plead, and there was Jan, stolid and grim as was his wont, already at attention under the lintel, a veritable tower of strength in support of his chief's decisions. Jan was not in the habit of arguing with his lordship. This, or any other order, was as one to him. As for the blind vagabond, well, Jan was as eager as his magnificence to get the noose around the rascal's throat. There were plenty of old scores to settle between them. The humiliation of 3 months ago, which had sent Stoutenburg, disgraced and a fugitive, out of the land, had hit Jan severely too. And that never-to-be-forgotten discomfiture was entirely due to this miserable caitiff, who, indeed, would get naught but his deserts. The task, in truth, was a congenial one to Jan. A blind man was easy enough to deal with, and this one offered but little resistance. He had been half asleep, it seems, and only woke to find himself on the brink of eternity. Even so, his good humor did not forsake him. "Odds fish!" he exclaimed, when, roughly shaken from his somnolence, he found himself in the hands of the soldiery. "I had forgotten this hanging business. You might have left a man to finish his dreams in peace." He appeared dazed, and his speech was thick. He had been drinking heavily all the evening, and, save for an odd moment or so of lucid interval, he had been hopelessly fuddled all along. And he was merry in his cups. Laughter came readily to his lips. He was full of quips and sallies, too, which kept the men in rare good humor. In truth, the fellow would joke and sing apparently until the hangman's rope smothered all laughter in his throat. But he had an unquenchable thirst, entreated the men to bring him a jug of wine. "Spanish wine," he pleaded. "I dote on Spanish wine, but had so little of it to drink in my day. That villainous rascal Pythagoras, some of you must have known the pot-bellied loon, would always seize all there was to get. He and Socrates, 2 scurvy renegades who should hang 'stead o' me. Give me a mug of wine for mercy's sake." The men had none to give, and the matter was referred to Jan. "Not another drop," Jan declared with unanswerable finality. "The knave is quite drunk enough as it is." "Ah," the blind man protested with ludicrous vehemence, "but there thou art wrong, worthy Jan. No man is ever drunk enough. He may be top-heavy, He may be as drunk as a lord, or as fuddled as David's sow. He may be fuzzy, foul, or merely sottish, but sufficiently drunk? No. A shout of laughter from the men greeted this solemn pronouncement. Jan shrugged his shoulders impatiently. "Well, that is as may be," he rejoined gruffly, "but not another drop to drink wilt thou get from me." "Oh, Jan," the poor man protested, with a pitiable note of appeal. "My good Jan, think on it. I am about to hang. Wouldst refuse the last request of a dying man?" "Thou art about to hang," Jan assented, unmoved. "Therefore, 'twere a pity to waste good liquor on thee." "I'll pay thee well, my good Jan," Diogenes put in, with a knowing wink of his sightless eyes. "Pay me?" Jan retorted, with a grim laugh. "'Tis not much there's left in thy pockets, I'm thinking." "No," the blind man agreed, nodding gravely. "These good men here did, in truth, empty my pockets effectually a while ago. 'Twas not the coin I meant to repay thee, good Jan." "With what, then?" "Information, Jan," the blind man replied, sinking his voice to a hoarse whisper. "Information for the like of which his lordship of Stoutenburg would give his ears." Jan laughed derisively. The men laughed openly. They thought this but another excellent joke on the part of the droll fellow. "Bah!" Jan said, with a shrug of the shoulder. "How should a varlet like thee know aught of which his lordship hath not full cognizance already?" "His lordship," the other riposted quickly, even whilst a look of impish cunning overspread his face, "his lordship never was in the confidence of the stadtholder. I was. What hath the stadtholder to do with the matter?" "Oh, nothing, nothing," the blind man replied airily. "Thou art obstinate, my good Jan, and 'tis not I who would force thee to share a secret for the possession of which, let me assure thee, his lordship would repay me not only with a tankard of his best wine, but with my life. Aye, and with a yearly pension of 1,000 guilders to boot." These last few words he had spoken quite slowly and with grave deliberation, his head nodding sagely while he spoke. The look of cunning in those spectral orbs had lent to his pale, wan face an air of elfin ghoulishness. He was swaying on his feet, and now and again the men had to hold him up, for he was on the very point of measuring his length on the hall floor. Jan did not know what to make of it all. Obviously the man was drunk, but not so drunk that he did not know what he was talking about, and the air of cunning suggested that there was something alive in the fuddled brain. Jan looked across the hall in the direction of the banqueting room. The doors were wide open, and he could see that his lordship, who at first had paced up and down the long room like a caged beast, had paused quite close to the door, then advanced on tiptoe out into the hall, where he had remained for the last minute or two, intent and still, with eager, probing glance fixed upon the blind man. Now, when Jan questioned him with a look, he gave his faithful henchman a scarce perceptible sign, which the latter was quick enough to interpret correctly. "Thou dost set my mouth to water," he said to the blind man, with well-assumed carelessness. "By all this talk of yearly pensions and of guilders, I am a poor man, and not so young as I was. 1,000 guilders a year would keep me in comfort for the rest of my life. Yet art so obstinate, Diogenes riposted with a quaint, inane laugh, as to deny me a tankard of Spanish wine, which might put thee in possession of my secret, a secret, good Jan, worth yearly pensions and more to his lordship. How do I know thou art not a consummate liar? Jan protested gruffly. I am, the other riposted, wholly unruffled. I am. Lying hath been my chief trade ever since I was breeched. Had I not lied to the stadtholder, he would not have entrusted his secrets to me, and I could not have bartered these secrets for a tankard of good Spanish wine. Thy vaunted secrets may not be worth a tankard of wine. They are, friend Jan, they are. Try them and see. Well, let's hear them, and, if they are worth it, I'll pay thee with a tankard of his lordship's best Oporto. But the blind man shook his head with owlish solemnity. And then sell them to his lordship, he retorted, for pensions and what not, whilst thine own hand, mayhap, puts the rope around my neck. No, no, my good Jan, say no more about it. I'd as lief see his lordship and thee falling into the stadtholder's carefully laid trap and getting murdered in your beds, even while I am on my journey to kingdom come. Who is going to murder us? Jan queried, frowning and puzzled, trying to get his cue once more from his master. And how? I'll not tell thee, the blind man replied, with a quick turn to that obstinacy which so oft pertains to the drunkard. Not if thou wert to plunge me in a bath of best Oporto. Some of the men began to murmur. We all might share? One or two of them suggested. Let's hear what it is, others declared. I'll tell thee, knave, what I'll do, Jan rejoined decisively. I'll bring thee a tankard of Oporto to loosen thy tongue. Then, if thy secret is indeed as important as thou dost pretend, I'll see that the hangman is cheated of thy carcass. For a while the blind man pondered. Loosen my hands then, friend Jan, he said, for, in truth, I am trussed like a fowl. Then let's feel the handle of that tankard. After that, we'll talk. Part 4. The soldiers sat around the table, watching the blind man with grave attention. At a sign from Jan, they soon loosened his bonds. There was something magnetic in the air just then, something that sent sensitive nerves a-quiver, and of which these rough fellows were only vaguely conscious. They could not look on that drunken loon without laughing. He was more comical than ever now, with that air of bland beatitude upon his face as his slender fingers closed around the handle of the tankard which Jan had just placed in his hand. I would sell my soul for a butt of this nectar, he said, and drank in the odor of the wine with every sign of delight, even before he raised the tankard to his lips. The Lord of Stoutenburg watched the blind man too. A deep furrow between his brows testified to the earnest concentration of his thoughts. The man knew something, or thought he knew, of that his lordship could not be in doubt. The question was that knowledge of such importance as the miserable wretch averred, or was he merely, like any rogue who sees the rope dangling before his eyes, trying to gain a respite by proposing vain bargains or selling secrets that had only found birth in his own fuddled brain? Stoutenburg, remember, was no psychologist. Indeed, psychology did not exist as a science in these days when men were overbusy with fighting and had no time or desire to probe into the inner workings of one another's soul. On the other hand, he was a man, thus his lordship argued to himself, who might know something of the stadtholder's plans. He was wont, before he rolled so rapidly down the hill of manhood and repute, to be an intimate of Maurice of Nassau. He might, as lately as yesterday, have been initiated into the great soldier's plans for repelling this sudden invasion of the land which he had thought secure. The stadtholder, in truth, was not the man to abandon all efforts at resistance just because his original plans had failed. True, the attempt to rescue Arnheim and Nijmegen had ended in smoke. Marquette and de Cassier were, thanks to timely warning, being held up somewhere by the armies of Isenborg and de Burgh. But Maurice of Nassau would not, of a certainty, thus lightly abandon all hopes of saving Gelderland. He must have formulated a project, and Stoutenburg, who was no fool, was far from underestimating the infinite brain power and resourcefulness of that peerless commander. Whether he had communicated that project to this besotted oaf was another matter. Stoutenburg searched the blind man's face with an intent glance that seemed to probe the innermost thoughts behind the fine, wide brow. For the moment, the face told him nothing. It was just vacant. The sightless eyes shone with delight, and the tankard raised to the lips effectually hid all expression around the mouth. Well, there was not much harm done, the waste of a few moments, if the information proved futile. Jan was ready with the rope, if the whole thing proved to be a mere trick for putting off the fateful hour. As the Lord of Stoutenburg gazed on the blind man, trying vainly to curb his burning impatience, he instinctively thought of Gilda. Gilda, and his hopeless wooing of her coldness toward him, and her passionate adherence to this miserable caitiff, who, in truth, had thrown dust in her eyes by an outward show of physical courage and a mock display of spurious chivalry. What if the varlet had been initiated in the stadtholder's projects? What if he betrayed them now, sold them in exchange for his own worthless life, and stood revealed, before all the world, as an abject coward, as base as any Judas who would sell his master for 30 pieces of silver? The thought turned the miscreant giddy, so dazzling did this issue appear before his mental vision. What a revelation for a fond and loyal woman, who had placed so worthless an object on a pinnacle of valor. What a disillusionment! She had staunchly believed in his integrity up to now. But after this? In truth, what more can a man desire than to see the honor of a rival smirched in the eyes of the woman who spurns him? That was the main thought that coursed through Stoutenburg's brain, driving before it all obstinacy and choler, aye, even soothing his exacerbated nerves. He gave a sign to Jan. "Bring that varlet here to me," he commanded. "I'll speak to him myself." The sound of his voice chased the look of beatitude from the blind man's face, which took on an expression of bewildered surprise. "I had no thought his lordship was here," he said, with a self-conscious, inane laugh. The men were murmuring more audibly. Some of them had seen visions of good reward, shared amongst them all, after the blind man had been made to speak. But Jan paid no heed to their discontent. In a trice he had the blind man secure once more, with arms tied as before behind his back. Diogenes had uttered a loud cry of protest when the empty tankard was torn out of his hand. "Jan," he shouted in a thick, hoarse voice, "if thou art a knave and dost not keep faith with me, the devil himself will run away with thee." "His magnificence will hear what thou hast to say," Jan retorted gruffly. "After that, we'll see." He led the prisoner through into the banqueting hall, and despite the men's murmurings, he closed the door upon them. He sat the blind man down in a chair opposite his lordship. The poor loon had begun to whimper softly, just like a child, and continued to appeal pitiably to Jan. "If his lordship is satisfied," he murmured confidingly, "you'll see to it, Jan, that I do not hang." "Jan has his orders," his lordship put in roughly. "But take heed, sirrah. If your information is worth having, you may go to hell your own way. I care not. But remember," he added, with slow and stern emphasis, "if you trick me in this, 'twill not be the rope for you at dawn, but the stake." Diogenes gave a quick shudder. "By the Lord," he said blandly, "how very unpleasant. But I am a man of my word. Jan put good wine into me. He shall be paid for it. And I'll tell you what the stadtholder hath planned for the defeat of the Lord of Stoutenburg." "Well," his lordship retorted curtly, "I wait." There was silence for a moment whilst the blind man apparently collected his thoughts. He sat, trussed and helpless, in the chair, with his head thrown back, and the full light of the candles playing upon his pale face, the latter still vacant, and with a childish expression of excitement about those weird dark orbs. The Lord of Stoutenburg, master of the situation, sat in a high-backed chair opposite him, his chin resting in his hand, his eyes, glowering and fierce, searching that strange, mysterious face before him. Strange and mysterious, in truth, with those sightless eyes that glittered uncannily whenever the flickering candlelight caught the abnormally dilated pupils, and those quavering lips which every moment broke into a whimsical and inane smile. "Jan, my friend," the blind man asked after a while, "art here?" "Aye, Jan," replied gruffly, "I'm here right enough to see that thou art not up to mischief." "How can I be that, worthy Jan?" the other retorted blandly, "since thou hast again trussed me like a capon?" "Well, the sooner thou hast satisfied his lordship," Jan rejoined with stolid indifference, "the sooner thou wilt be free." "To go to hell mine own way," Diogenes put in with a hiccough. "So his lordship hath pledged his word. Let all those who are my friends bear witness that his lordship did pledge his word." He paused, and once again a look of impish cunning overspread his face. He seemed to be preparing for a fateful moment which literally would mean life or death for him. An exclamation of angry impatience from Stoutenburg recalled him to himself. "I am ready," he protested with eager civility, "to do his lordship's pleasure." "Then speak, man," Stoutenburg retorted savagely, "ere I wring the words from thee with torture." "I was only thinking how to put the matter clearly," Diogenes protested blandly. "The stadtholder only outlined his plan to me. There was so little time. My friend Klaas will remember that after His Highness's horse bolted across the moor, I was able to stop it." "Yes, curse your interference," Stoutenburg muttered between his teeth. "Amen to that," the blind man assented. "But for it, I should still have the privilege of beholding your lordship's pleasing countenance. But at the moment I had no thought save to stop a runaway horse." The stadtholder was mightily excited, scented that a trap had been laid for him. "My friend Klaas again will remember that, after his highness dismounted, he stopped to parley with me upon the moor." Nicholas nodded. "Then it was," Diogenes went on, "that he told me what he meant to do. I was, of course, to bear my part in the new project, which was to make a feint upon Ada." "A feint upon Ada?" "Aye, a surprise attack, which would keep de Burgh, who is in Ada, busy whilst the stadtholder—" "Bah!" Stoutenburg broke in contemptuously. "De Burgh is too wary to be caught by a feint." "So he is, my lord, so he is," Diogenes rejoined with solemn gravity. "But if I were to tell you that the surprise attack is to be made in full force, and that the weight will fall on the south side of the town, what then? I do not see with what object. Yet you, my lord, would know the stadtholder's tactics of old. You fought under his banner once. Before he murdered my father, yes, Stoutenburg broke in impatiently. He did not relish this allusion to his former fighting days, before black treachery had made him betray the ruler he once served. But what of that? For then your lordship would remember, the blind man went on placidly, that the stadtholder's favorite plan was always to draw the enemy away by a ruse from his own chief point of attack. But where would the chief point of attack be in this case? Stoutenburg queried, with a frown. At a certain Molen, your lordship what of on the Veluwe? Impossible. Oh, impossible? Your lordship is pleased to jest. Some days ago, spies came into Utrecht with the information that the Lord of Stoutenburg had his camp at an old Molen, which stands disused and isolated on the highest point of the Veluwe, somewhere between Apeldoorn and Barneveld. My camp? Bah! The mill was only a halting place. The spies averred, my lord, the blind man broke in blandly, that vast stores of arms and ammunition are accumulated in that halting place, and that the attack on Amersfoort was planned within its rickety walls. Then, as the Lord of Stoutenburg made no comment on this, indeed, he had cast a rapid, significant glance on Nicholas, who throughout this colloquy had appeared as keen, as interested as his friend, the blind man went on slowly. The stadtholder's objective is the Molen on the Veluwe. What, from Ada? Nicholas exclaimed. No, no. Have I not said that the attack on Ada would be a feint? It will be the stadtholder himself who, with a comparatively small force, will push on toward Barneveld and the Molen, and at once cut off all communication between Ada and Amersfoort. I understand, Stoutenburg rejoined, with a grave nod. But if it is a small force, we can easily— You can now, Diogenes assented coolly, since you are warned. Quite right, eh, friend Nicholas, his lordship retorted, and strove to let his harsh voice express a world of withering contempt. If all this is not a trick, yon varlet hath served us well. What say you? Shall we let him go to hell his own way, and save the hangman a deal of pother? If it all prove true, Nicholas put in cautiously. But what proof have we? None, in truth, nor would I let this craven vagabond out of yon sight until we do make sure that he hath not lied. But there'll be no harm in being prepared. Here, sirrah, his lordship continued, once more addressing the blind man. With how strong a force doth the stadtholder propose to cut us off from Ada? But during this brief colloquy between the two friends, the blind man had begun to nod. His head fell forward on his chest. The heavy lids veiled the stricken eyes, and anon a peaceable snore came through the partially open mouth. Stoutenburg swore, as was his wont, the moment his choler was roused, and Jan shook the prisoner roughly by the shoulder. What? The latter queried, blinked his sightless eyes, and turned a pale and startled face vaguely from side to side. What is it? Where's that confounded— Answer his lordship's question, Jan commanded briefly. Question? What question? Your lordship must forgive me. I am so fatigued, and that tankard of— I asked thee, knave, Stoutenburg broke in impatiently, with how strong a force the stadtholder proposed to cut us off from Ada. Call it 4,000, my lord, the blind man babbled, and let me go to sleep. You shall sleep till Judgment Day when I've done with you, sirrah. Will the stadtholder lead that force in person? The blind man winked and blinked, tried to collect his thoughts, which apparently had all wandered off toward the land of Nod. Then he said, The plan was to leave the bulk of that force to menace Amersfoort, but the stadtholder himself meant to push on as far as the Molen, with but a few hundred of his picked men. He thought to seize the stores of arms and ammunition there, and then to await the coming of the Lord of Stoutenburg, who, driven out of Amersfoort and cut off from Ada, would make of necessity for his headquarters. Ah! The exclamation, deep and prolonged, came from 3 pairs of lips. Stoutenburg, Nicholas, and Jan looked at one another, and there was triumph and satisfaction depicted in their glance. The same thought had occurred simultaneously to these 3 traders, the stadtholder, with a comparatively small force, pushing on to the lonely Molen on the Veluwe, not knowing that some of de Burgh's troops were holding the Eisel beyond. He would be caught like a rat in a trap, and the question was whether it would not be better to allow him to carry out his plan, not to oppose him on his way, to let him reach the Molen and then close in behind him, so that he would have but 2 alternatives before him, to surrender in the Molen or to turn his small force in the direction of the Zuiderzee and therein seek a watery grave. Chapter 14.2 of the First Sir Percy. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Wayne Hom. The First Sir Percy by Baroness Orczy. Chapter 14. Treachery. Part 5. I must have a little time to think, Stoutenburg muttered to himself after a while. The blind man had apparently dropped off to sleep again. His head had once more fallen forward on his chest. Jan was prepared to give him another rude awakening, but his lordship stopped him with a sign. "Let the muckworm sleep," he said. "I must think out the whole position. If what the knave says is true—" "I am inclined to believe it true," Nicholas interposed. "The man is too fuddled to have invented so circumstantial a story, and I have it in my mind," he added reflectively, "that when the stadtholder visited Amersfoort yesterday, he said something to my father about devising a plan later on if the city were seriously threatened." "Then by Satan, all would be well indeed," and Stoutenburg drew up his gaunt figure to its full height, looked already every inch a conqueror, with heel set upon the neck of his foes. Jan alone looked dubious. "I wouldn't trust the rogue," he said grimly. "Would you hang him now?" Stoutenburg retorted. "No, I would wait to make sure. Let him sleep a while now. When he wakes out of his booze, he might be able to give us further details." "In the meanwhile," his lordship rejoined, "keep the men under arms, Jan. I have not yet thought the matter over, but this I know, that I'll start for the Molen with a few hundred musketeers and pikemen as soon as I am sure that this rascallion hath not spun a tissue of lies. Do you send out spies at once in every direction, with orders to bring back information immediately. We must hear if an attack hath indeed been made on Ada, and if the stadtholder is moving out of Utrecht. Have you some men you can trust?" "Oh, yes, so please your lordship," Jan replied. "I can send Piet Walleren in the direction of Ada, and I myself will push on toward Utrecht. We'd both be back long before dawn." "And 'tis not you who could be nozzled, good Jan?" his lordship was pleased to say. "If we have been tricked by this tosspot," Jan riposted gruffly, "I'll see him burnt alive, and 'tis mine own hand will set the brand to the stake." He paused, and drew in his breath with a shudder, for he had turned to look on the blind man, whom he was threatening with so dire a fate, and whom he had thought asleep, and encountered those sightless orbs fixed upon him as if they could see something through and beyond him, some ghoul or spectre lurking in a distant corner of the room. So uncanny and terrifying did the rascal look, indeed, that instinctively Jan, who believed neither in God nor the devil, remembered his mother's early teachings and made sundry and vague signs of the cross upon his breast, with a view to exorcising those evil spirits which must be somewhere lurking about, unseen by all save the man who had lost his sight. "What is it now?" Stoutenburg queried with a scowl. The blind man indeed appeared to be listening so intently, with head now craned forward and eyes fixed into vacancy, that instinctively the three recreants listened too. To what they could not have told. Through the open casement the sound of life, camp life, of the sentries' challenging call, of bivouac fires and rowdy soldiery, came in as before. A little less roisterous, perhaps, seeing that most of the men, tired after long days of marching and hours of carousing, had settled themselves down to sleep. Inside the room, the monumental clock up against the wall ticked off each succeeding second with tranquil monotony. It was now close upon midnight. Nothing had happened, nothing could have happened, to disturb the wonted tenor of the life of an army in temporary occupation of an unresisting city. Nothing, in fact, unless that blind tatterdemalion over there had indeed spoken the truth. And still he listened. A vague anxiety seemed to have completely banished sleep, even momentarily to have dissipated the potent effect of that excellent Oporto, and on his face there was that strained look peculiar to those who had been robbed of one sense and are at pains to exert the others to their utmost power. It seemed as if his sightless orbs must pierce some hidden veil which kept vital secrets hidden from ordinary human gaze. And these three men, traitors all, whose craven hearts, weighted with crime, were sensitive to every uncanny spell, felt their own senses unaccountably thrilled by that motionless, stony image of a man whose very soul appeared on the alert, and in whom life itself was, as it were, momentarily arrested. The spell continued for a moment or two. A minute, perhaps, went by. Then, with an impatient curse, Stoutenburg jumped to his feet, strode rapidly to the window, and, leaning out far over the sill, he listened. Indeed, at first it was naught but the habitual confused sounds that reached his ear, but as he, in his turn, strained every sense to hear, something unusual seemed to mingle with the other sounds. A murmuring, strange voices, a few isolated words that rose above the others, louder than the sentry's call, also a patter of feet, like men running, and a clang of arms that at this hour should have been stilled. The Lord of Stoutenburg could not have told you then why those sounds should have suddenly filled his mind with foreboding, why, indeed, he heard them at all. Beneath the window, ranged against the wall, the men of his picked company were sleeping peacefully. Their bivouac fire, fed by those on guard, shed a pleasant glow over the familiar scene. Beyond its ruddy gleam, everything looked by contrast impenetrably dark. The river beyond the quay appeared like a yawning abyss of tenebration, and beyond it nothing, only blackness, a blackness that could be felt. The lights of the city had long since been extinguished. Only one tiny glimmer, which came from a small oil lamp, showed above the copple port. But that confused sound, that murmuring, came from the rear of the burgomaster's house, from the direction of the marketplace, where the bulk of his lordship's army was encamped. "What in thunder does it mean?" Stoutenburg muttered. Nicholas came and joined him by the window. He too strained his ears to hear, feeling his nerves vaguely stirred by a kind of superstitious dread. But Stoutenburg turned to the blind man and tried to read an answer in the latter's white, set face. Jan shook Diogenes fiercely by the shoulder. "Dost hear, knave?" he said harshly. "What does it all mean?" "What does what mean, worthy Jan?" the blind man queried blandly. "Thou art listening for something. What is it? His lordship desires to know." "Canst thou hear anything, friend Jan?" the other riposted serenely. "Only the usual sounds. What should I hear?" The armies of the stadtholder on the move. An exclamation of incredulity broke from Stoutenburg's lips. Nevertheless, he turned imperatively to Jan. "Go, or send at once into the town," he commanded. "Let us hear if anything has happened." In a moment Jan was out of the room, and soon his gruff voice could be heard from outside, questioning and giving orders. He had gone himself to see what was amiss. And Stoutenburg, half incredulous, yet laboring under strong excitement, once more approached the window and, leaning far out into the night, set his ears to listen. His senses, too, were keyed up now, detached as they were from everything else except just what went on outside. The subdued murmurings reached his perceptions independently of every other sound. A hum of voices, and through it that of Jan, questioning and commanding, and others that talked agitatedly, with many interruptions. After a while he felt that he could stand the strain no longer. Very obviously something had happened. Something was being discussed out on the marketplace, and there was a kind of buzzing in the air, as if around the hive of bees that had been disturbed by a company of robber wasps. And to him, Stoutenburg, for whom that buzzing might mean the first step up toward the pinnacle of his desires, the turning point of his destiny, beyond which lay power, dominion, ambition satisfied, and passion satiated, every moment of suspense and silence became positive torture. A primeval, savage instinct would, but for the presence of Nicholas, have driven him to seizing the helpless prisoner by the throat, and thus to ease the tension on his nerves and still the wild hammering of blood on his temples. But Nicholas did, as it happened, exercise in this instance a restraining influence on his friend, quite unknowingly, of course, as his was the weaker nature. But the last half-hour had wrought a marked change in Stoutenburg, a subtle one which he himself could not have defined. Before then he had been striving for great things, for revenge, for power, for the satisfaction of his passions. But now he felt that he had attained all that and more. Obviously his stricken enemy had not lied. The stadtholder was about to fall into a trap which was easy enough to set. The once brilliant Laughing Cavalier had sunk to a state of moral and physical degradation from which he could never now recover. And Gilda had but to realize the slough of turpitude into which her former lover had sunk to turn gratefully and with a sigh of infinite relief to the man who had freed her from such a yoke. In truth, Stoutenburg felt that he no longer needed to climb. He had reached the summit of ambition, of power, of sentimental satisfaction. He was a conqueror now, master in the land of his birth, the future stadtholder of the United Province, wedded to the richest heiress in the Netherlands, happy, feared, and obeyed. That was his position now, and that was the cause of the subtle change in him. a change which forced him to keep his savage instincts in check before his servile friend, forced him to try and appear before others as above petty passions, a justiciary and not a terrorist. Part 6. The minutes sped by, leaden-footed for the impatience of these two men. Nicholas and Stoutenburg, each trying to appear calm, hardly dared to speak with one another lest their speech betrayed the exacerbation of their nerves. It was Nicholas's turn now to pace up and down the room, to halt beside the window and peer out into the darkness in search of Jan's familiar figure. Stoutenburg had once more taken a seat on the high-backed chair, striving to look dignified and detached. His arm was thrown over the table, and with his sharply pointed nails he was drumming a devil's tattoo on the board. Alone, the blind man appeared perfectly serene. After that brief moment of comparative lucidity, he had relapsed into somnolence. Occasional loud snores testified that he was once more wandering in the Elysian fields of unconsciousness. Half an hour after midnight, Jan returned. "There is no doubt about it," were the first words he spoke. "An attack on Ada appears to be in progress, and the stadtholder left his camp at Utrecht a couple of hours ago with a force of 4,000 men. He was out of breath, having run, he said, all the way from the Jorisport, where he had gleaned the latest information." "Who brought the news?" his lordship asked. "No one seems to know, my lord," Jan replied, "but every one in the town has it. The rumor hath spread like wildfire. It started at opposite quarters of the city. The new port had it that a surprise attack had been delivered on Ada earlier in the evening, and the Jorisport that the stadtholder and his force are on the move. The captains at the gates had heard the news from runners who had come direct from Utrecht and from Ada. Where are those runners now? In both cases, the captain sent them back for further information. The fellows were willing enough to go for a consideration, but the business has become a dangerous one, for the roads to Utrecht and Ada, they averred, are already full of the stadtholder's vedettes." "Bah!" Stoutenburg ejaculated contemptuously, "a device for extorting money." "Probably," Jan riposted dryly, "but the money will be well spent if we get the information. The men are not to be paid until they return." "And if they do not return?" Jan shrugged his shoulders. "If the spies did not return, it would go to prove that the stadtholder's vedettes were not asleep. I sent Piet Wallerin and one or two others out too," he added, "with orders to push on both roads as far as possible, and bring back any information they can obtain. The sooner the better." "They have not yet returned?" Stoutenburg asked. "Oh no, they only have been gone half an hour." "Is the night very dark?" "Very dark, my lord." "Piet may never get back." "In that case we shall know that the stadtholder's vanguard has sighted him," Jan rejoined coolly. "Nothing else would keep Piet from getting back." Stoutenburg nodded approval. "You think, then, that this varlet here spoke the truth?" he asked again. "I have no longer any doubt of it, my lord," Jan gave reply. "Though I did not actually speak with the men who seem originally to have brought the news, the captains at the ports had no doubt whatever as to its authenticity. But we shall know for certain before dawn. Piet and the others will have returned by then, or not, as the case may be, but we shall know." "And, of course, we are prepared?" "To do just what your lordship commands. The men will be under arms within the next 2 hours, and I can seek the master of the camp, and send him at once to your lordship for instructions. Mine instructions are simple enough, good Jan, and thou canst convey them to the master of the camp thyself. They are to remain quiescent, under arms but asleep, to surrender the town if it be attacked." "To surrender?" Jan protested with a frown. "We must throw dust in the stadtholder's eyes," Stoutenburg riposted. "Give the idea that we are feeble and unprepared, and that I have fled out of Amersfoort. The surrender of the city and its occupation will keep the main force busy, whilst Maurice of Nassau, anxious to possess himself of our person, will push on as far as the Molen, where I, in the meanwhile, will be waiting for him." His voice rang with a note of excitement and of triumph. "With the stadtholder a prisoner in my hands," he exclaimed, "I can command the surrender of all his forces, and then the whole of the Netherlands will be at my feet." Never in his wildest dreams had he hoped for this. Fate, in very truth, had tired of smiting him, had an overfull cornucopia for him now, and was showering down treasures upon him one by one. Part 7. It was Nicholas who first remembered the blind man. During the last momentous half-hour he had been totally forgotten. Stoutenburg during that time had been in close confabulation with Jan, discussing plans, making arrangements for the morrow's momentous expedition. Neither of them seemed to feel the slightest fatigue. They were men of iron, whom their passions kept alive. But Nicholas was a man of straw. He had been racked by one emotion after the other all day, and now he was so tired that he could hardly stand. He envied the blind man every time that a lusty snore escaped the latter's lips, and tried to keep himself awake by going to the fire from time to time and throwing a log or two upon it. But he stood in too great an awe of his friend to dare own to fatigue when the future of his native land was under discussion. It was really in order to divert Stoutenburg's attention from these interminable discussions on what to do and what not to do on the morrow that presently, during a pause, he pointed to Diogenes. "What is to happen to this drunken loon?" he asked abruptly. Stoutenburg grinned maliciously. "Have no fear, friend Nicholas," he said. "The fate of our valued informer will be my special care. I have not forgotten him, Jan knows. While you were nodding, he and I arranged it all. You did not hear?" Nicholas shook his head. "No," he said. "What did you decide?" "You shall see, my good Klaus," Stoutenburg replied with grim satisfaction. "I doubt not but what you'll be pleased. And, since we have now finished the discussion of our plans, Jan will, at once, go and bid the Herr Burgomaster rise from his bed and attend upon our pleasure." "My father?" Nicholas exclaimed in surprise. "Why, what hath he—" "You will see, my good Klaus," the other broke in quietly. "You will see. I think that you will be satisfied." Jan, at his word, had already gone. Nicholas, really puzzled, tried to ask questions, but Stoutenburg was obviously determined to keep the secret of his intentions a while longer to himself. It was long past 1 o'clock now, and bitterly cold. Even the huge blazing logs in the monumental hearth failed to keep the large room at a pleasing temperature. Nicholas, shivering and yawning, crouched beside the blaze, knocked his half-frozen hands one against the other. He would at this moment have bartered most of his ambitions for the immediate prospect of a good bed, but Stoutenburg was as wide awake as ever, and evidently some kind of inward fever kept the cold out of his bones. After Jan's departure he resumed that restless pacing of his up and down the long room, up and down, until Nicholas, exasperated beyond endurance, could have screamed with choler. Less than a quarter of an hour later, the burgomaster arrived, ushered in by Jan. He had apparently not taken off his clothes since he had been upstairs. It was indeed more than likely that he had spent the time in prayer, for Mynheer Bernstein was a pious man, and the will of God in fortune or in adversity was a very real thing to him. With the same dignified submission which he had displayed throughout, he had immediately followed Jan when curtly ordered to do so. But he came down to face the arrogant tyrant for the third time tonight, with as heavy a heart as before, not knowing what fresh indignity, what new cruel measure would be put upon him. Grace or clemency he knew that he could not expect. The look of malignant triumph wherewith Stoutenburg greeted him appeared to justify his worst forebodings. The presence, too, of Diogenes, fettered and asleep, filled his anxious heart with additional dread. As he stepped out into the room, he took no notice of his son, but only strove to face his arch-enemy with as serene a countenance as he could command. "Your lordship desired that I should come," he said quietly. "What is your lordship's pleasure?" But Stoutenburg was all suavity. A kind of feline gentleness was in his tone as he replied, "Firstly, to beg your forgiveness, mynheer, for having disturbed you again, and at this hour. But will you not sit? Jan," he commanded, "draw a chair nearer to the hearth for the Herr Burgomaster." "I was not asleep, my lord," Berenstain rejoined coldly, "and by your leave will take your commands standing." "Oh, commands, mynheer," Stoutenburg rejoined blandly. "'Tis no commands I would venture to give you. It was my duty, my painful duty, not to keep you in ignorance of certain matters which have just come to my knowledge, and which will have a momentous bearing upon all my future plans. Will you not sit?" he added, with insidious urbanity. "No? Ah, well, just as you wish. But you will forgive me if I—" He sat down in his favorite chair, with his back to the table and the candlelight, and facing the fire, which threw ruddy gleams on his gaunt face and grizzled hair. His deep-set eyes were inscrutable in the shadow, but they were fixed upon the burgomaster, who stood before him dignified and calm, half turned away from the pitiful spectacle which the blind man presented in somnolent helplessness. "Since last I had the pleasure of addressing you, mynheer," Stoutenburg began slowly, after a while, "it hath come to my knowledge that the stadtholder, far from abandoning all hope of reconquering Gelderland from our advancing forces, did in truth not only devise a plan whereby he intended to deliver Ada and Amersfoort from our hands, but his far-reaching project also embraced the possibility of seizing my person, and once for all ridding himself of an enemy, a justiciary, shall we say, who is becoming mighty inconvenient." "A project, my lord," the burgomaster riposted earnestly, "which I pray God may fully succeed." Stoutenburg gave a derisive laugh. "So it would have done, mynheer," he said with a sardonic grin. "It would have succeeded admirably, and by this hour tomorrow I should no doubt be dangling on a gibbet, for Maurice of Nassau hath sworn that he would treat me as a knave and as a traitor, unworthy of the scaffold." "And the world would have been rid of a murderous miscreant," the burgomaster put in coldly, "had God so willed it." "Ah, but God, your God, mynheer," Stoutenburg retorted with a sneer, "did not will it, it seems, and forewarned is forearmed, you know." Instinctively, as the full meaning of Stoutenburg's words reached his perceptions, the burgomaster's eyes had sought those of his son, whilst a ghastly pallor overspread his face even to his lips. "The stadtholder's schemes have been revealed to you," he murmured slowly. "By whom?" Then, as Stoutenburg made no reply, only regarded him with a mocking and quizzical gaze, he added more vehemently, "Who is the craven informer who hath sold his master to you?" "What would you do to him if you knew?" Stoutenburg retorted coolly. "Slay him with mine own hand," the burgomaster replied calmly, "were he my only son." "'Twas not I," Nicholas cried involuntarily. Stoutenburg appeared vastly amused. "No," he said, "it was not your son, Klaus, whose merits, by the way, you have not yet learned to appreciate. Nicholas hath rendered me and the Archduchess immense services, which I hope soon to repay adequately. But, he added with mocking emphasis, the most signal service of all, which will deliver the stadtholder into my hands and re-establish thereby the dominion of Spain over the Netherlands, was rendered to me by the varlet whom, but for me, you would have acclaimed as your son. And, with a wide flourish of the arm, Stoutenburg turned in his chair and pointed to Diogenes, who, sublimely unconscious of what went on around him, was even in the act of emitting a loud and prolonged snore. Instinctively, the burgomaster looked at him. His glance, vague and puzzled, wandered over the powerful figure of the blind man, the nodding head, the pinioned shoulders, and from him back to Stoutenburg, who continued to regard him, Beresteyn, with a malicious leer. "I fear me," the latter murmured after a while, "that your lordship will think me over dull, but I don't quite understand." "Yet 'tis simple enough," Stoutenburg rejoined, rose from his chair, and approached the burgomaster, as he spoke with a sudden, fierce tone of triumph. "This miserable cur on whom Gilda once bestowed her love, seeing the gallows dangling before his bleary eyes, hath sold me the secrets which the stadtholder did entrust to him, sold them to me in exchange for his worthless life. I entered into a bargain with him, and I will keep my pledge. In very truth, he hath saved my life by his revelations, and jeopardized that of the stadtholder, my most bitter enemy. Maurice of Nassau had thought to trap me in the lonely Molen on the Veluwe, which is my secret camp. Now 'tis I who will close the trap on him there, and hold his life, his honor, these provinces at my mercy. And all," he concluded with a ringing shout, "thanks to the brilliant adventurer, the chosen of Gilda's heart, her English miller, mynheer, the gay and dashing Laughing Cavalier." He had the satisfaction of seeing that the blow had gone home. The burgomaster literally staggered under it, as if he had actually been struck in the face with a whip. Certain it is that he stepped back and clutched the table for support with one hand, whilst he passed the other once or twice across his brow. "My God," he murmured under his breath. Stoutenburg laughed as a demon might, when gazing on the tortured soul. Then he shrugged his shoulders and went on airily. "You are surprised, mynheer burgomaster. Frankly, I was not. You believed this fortune-hunter's tale of noble parentage and English ancestry. I did not. You doubted his treachery when he went on a message to Marquette and sold that message to de Burgh. I knew it to be a fact. My love for Gilda made me clear-sighted, whilst yours left you blind. Now you see him at last in his true colors, base, servile, without honor and without faith. You are bewildered, incredulous mayhap. Ask Jan. He was here and heard him. Ask my captains at the gate, my master of the camp. The stadtholder is heading straight for the trap which he had set up for me, because the cullion who sits there did sell his one-time master to me." The burgomaster, overcome with horror and with shame, had sunk into a chair and buried his face in his hands. The echo of Stoutenburg's rasping voice seemed to linger in the noble panelled hall, its mocking accents to be still tearing at the stricken father's aching heart, still deriding his overwhelming sorrow. Gilda, his proud, loving, loyal Gilda, if she were to know. A great sob, manfully repressed, broke from his throat and threatened to choke him. And, for the first time in this day of crime and of treachery, Nicholas felt a twinge of remorse knocking at the gates of his heart. He could not bear to look on his father's grief, and not feel the vague stirrings of an affection which had once been genuine, even though it was dormant now. His father had been perhaps more just toward him than indulgent. Gilda had been the apple of his eyes, and he, Nicholas, had been brought up in that stern school of self-sacrifice and self-repression which had made heroes of those of his race in their stubborn and glorious fight for liberty. No doubt it was that rigid bringing up which had primarily driven an ambitious and discontented youth like Nicholas into the insidious net spread out for him by the wily Stoutenburg. Smarting under the discipline imposed upon his self-indulgence by the burgomaster, he had lent a willing ear to the treacherous promises of his masterful friend, who held out dazzling visions before him of independence and of aggrandizement. Even at this moment, Nicholas felt no remorse for his treachery to his country and kindred. He was only sentimentally sorry to see his father so utterly broken down by sorrow. And then there was Gilda. Already, when Stoutenburg had placed that cruel either-or before her, Nicholas had felt an uncomfortable pain in his heart at sight of her misery. Stoutenburg would have called it weakness, and despised him for it. But Stoutenburg's was an entirely warped and evil nature, which reveled in crime and cruelty as a solace to past humiliation and disappointment, whereas Nicholas was just a craven time-server, who had not altogether succeeded in freeing himself from past teachings and past sentiments. And Gilda's pale, tear-stained face seemed to stare at him through the gloom, reproachful and threatening, whilst his father's heart-rending sob tore at his vitals and shook him to the soul with a kind of superstitious awe. The commandment of heaven, not wholly forgotten, not absolutely ignored, seemed to ring the death knell of all that he had striven for, as if the great judge of all had already weighed his deeds in the balance and decreed that his punishment be swift and sure. But Stoutenburg, in this the hour of his greatest triumph, had none of these weaknesses, nor indeed did he care whether the burgomaster was stricken with sorrow or no. What he did do now was go up to Jan, and from the latter's belt take out a pistol. This he examined carefully. Then he put it down upon the table, close to where the burgomaster was sitting. At the metallic sound made by the contact of the weapon upon the board, the burgomaster had instinctively looked up. Stoutenburg caught his eye, then quietly pointed to the pistol. "My friend Nicholas and I," he said, "will leave you to deal with the informer as you think best." He stayed quite still for a moment, looking down into the horror-stricken, yet determined face of the burgomaster, and then at the blind man, who apparently was fast asleep. Then he curtly ordered Jan and Nicholas to follow him, and strode leisurely out of the room. Part 8. A quarter of an hour later, the stately house on the quay appeared wrapped in the mantle of sleep. The soldiers, wearied and discontented, had, after a good deal of murmuring, finally settled down to rest. They had collected what clothes, blankets, curtains even, that they could lay their hands on, and, wrapped up in these, they had curled themselves up upon the floor. We may take it, however, as a certainty that Jan remained wide awake, with one ear on that door which gave on the banqueting hall, and which he, at the command of his master, had carefully closed behind him. Upstairs, Nicholas had thrown himself like an insentient and wearied mass upon his own bed in the room wherein he had slept as a child, as an adolescent, as a youth, now as a black-hearted traitor, haunted by memories and the ghoulish shadows of his crime. He could not endure the darkness, so left a couple of wax candles burning in their sconces. Whether he actually fell asleep or no, he could not afterward have told you. Certain it is that he was not fully awake, but rather on that threshold of dreams which for those that are happy is akin to the very gate of paradise, but unto souls that are laden with crime is like the antechamber of hell. Half consciously, Nicholas could hear Stoutenburg pacing up and down an adjoining room, restless and fretful, like some untamed beast on the prowl. Then suddenly the sharp report of a pistol rang through the silence of the night. Nicholas jumped from his bed with a feeling of sheer physical nausea, which turned him dizzy and faint. Stoutenburg had paused abruptly in his febrile wanderings. To the listener it almost seemed as if he could hear his friend's labored breathing, the indrawing of a sigh that spoke of torturing suspense. A few minutes went by, and then a heavy step was heard ascending the stairs. After that, the closing and shutting of a door, then nothing more. In that heavy step, Nicholas had recognized his father's. Even now he could hear the burgomaster moving about in the room close by, which had always been his. Gilda's was further along, down the passage. Everything now seemed so still. Just for a while, after the burgomaster had gone upstairs, Nicholas had heard the soldiers moving down below. Rudely awakened from their sleep, they had done a good deal of muttering. Voices could be heard, and then a rattle, like the shaking of a door. But apparently the men had been quickly reassured by Jan. The silence acted as a further irritant on Nicholas's nerves. Taking up a candle, he went out of the room in search of Stoutenburg. Outside on the landing he came upon Jan, who was on the same errand bent. "What has happened?" the young man queried hoarsely. Jan shook his head. "Which is his lordship's room?" was all that he said. Nicholas led the way, and Jan followed. They found Stoutenburg standing in the middle of the room which he had selected for his own use. He was still fully dressed, had not even taken off his boots. Apparently he was waiting for news, but otherwise he seemed quite calm. "Well?" he queried curtly, as soon as he caught sight of Jan. "We cannot get into the room," Jan replied. "After we heard the shot fired, we saw the burgomaster come out of it, but he locked the door, and, with the key in his hand, he walked steadily up the stairs." "How did he look?" "Like a man who had seen a ghost." "Well?" Stoutenburg queried again, impatiently. "What did you do after that?" "I tried the door, of course. It is a stout piece of oak, and I had no orders to break it down. It would take a heavy joist, and the men are already grumbling." "Yes," Stoutenburg put in curtly, "but the windows?" "I thought of them, and myself went round to look. Of course we could climb up to them, but they appeared to be barred and shuttered." "So much the better," his lordship retorted, with a note of grim spite in his rasping voice. "Let the varlet's carcass rot where it is. Why should we trouble? Go back to bed, Nicholas," he added after a slight pause, "and you too, Jan. As for me, I feel that I could sleep peacefully at last." He threw himself on the bed with a long sigh of satisfaction, and when spoken to again by one of the others, he curtly ordered them to leave him in peace. So Jan did leave him and went back to his men, but Nicholas, terrified of solitude, which he felt would for him be peopled with ghouls, elected to find what rest he could in an armchair beside his friend. After a few minutes later, the house was once more wrapped in the mantle of sleep. End of Chapter 14.
Chapter 15 of The First Sir Percy. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The First Sir Percy by Baroness Orczy. Chapter 15. The Molen on the Veluwe. Again, it is to Devoe's highly interesting and reliable Breven that we like to turn for an account of the Lord of Stoutenburg's departure out of Amersfoort. It occurred at dawn of a raw, dull March morning, and was effected with all the furtiveness, the silence usually pertaining to a surprise attack. The soldiers bivouacking inside that part of the city knew nothing of the whole affair, but few of them did as much as turn in their sleep when his lordship rode through the Koppelpoort together with 4 companies of cavaliers. Jan was an adept at arranging these expeditions, and the Lord of Stoutenburg had made a specialty of marauding excursions ever since he had started on his career of treachery against his own country. His standard bearer preceded the companies, carrying the sable standard embroidered in silver, with the skull and crossbones, which his lordship had permanently adopted as his device. But they went without drums or pipes, and with as little clatter as may be, choosing the unpaved streets whereon the mud lay thick and effectually deadened the sound of horses' hoofs. A litter taken from the burgomaster's coach-house and borne by 2 strung Flemish horses bore the Jongjuffrouw Gilde Brestjen in the train of her future lord. She had offered no resistance, no protest of any kind, when fully ordered by her brother to make herself ready. She had spent the greater part of the night in meditation and in prayer. Her father, hearing her move about in her room, had come to her in the small hours of the morning, and had sat with her for some time. Nicolas, wakeful and restless, had wandered out into the corridor on which gave most of the sleeping rooms, and had heard the subdued murmurings of the burgomaster's voice, and occasionally that of his sister. What they said he could not hear, but he was able subsequently to assure Stoutenburg that the burgomaster's tone was distinctly one of admonition, and Gilda's one of patience and resignation. Just before dawn, one of the old serving men, who had remained on the watch in the house all through the night, brought her some warm milk and bread, which she swallowed eagerly. The burgomaster was with her then, but later on, when the Lord of Stoutenburg desired her presence in the living room, she went to him alone. That room was the one where, a little more than a week ago, the stadtholder had held council with the burgomaster and his friends on the day of her wedding, and she had sat in the little room next to it and played on the virginal, so as to attract her beloved to her side. Then had come the hour of parting, and she had with her own hands taken his sword to him, and buckled it to his side, and bade him go whither honor and duty beckoned. My God, what memories! But she met Stoutenburg's mocking glance with truly remarkable serenity. She felt neither faint nor weak. Her communion with God, her interview with her father, had given her all the strength she needed, not to let her enemies see what she suffered, or if she were afraid. And when Stoutenburg, with callous irony, reminded her of his decision, she answered quite calmly, "I am ready to do your wish, my lord." "And you'll not regret it, Gilda," he vowed with sudden earnestness, and his sunken eyes lighted up with a kind of fierce ardor which sent a cold shudder coursing down her spine. "By heaven, you'll not regret it. You shall be the greatest lady in Europe, the most admired, the most beloved. I, with you beside me, I feel that I shall have the power to create a throne, a kingdom for us both. Queen of the Netherlands, mine angel. What say you to this goal? and I see your king—" He paused and closely scrutinized her face, marveled what she knew of that drunken oaf, once her lover, who now lay dead in the room below, slain by the avenging hand of an outraged father and an indignant patriot. But she looked so serene that he came to the conclusion that she knew nothing. The burgomaster had apparently desired to spare her, for the moment, this additional horror and shame. Well, no doubt it was all for the best. She was ready to come with him. And that, after all, was the principal thing. In any event, she knew the alternative. "Jan remains here," he said, "in command of the troops. He will not leave until I send him word." Until then, Amersfoort and the lives of all its citizens were in jeopardy. The quick, sacred look in her eyes, when he reminded her of this, was sufficient to assure him that she fully grasped the position. Of the stadtholder's plans, as betrayed by the informer, she knew of course nothing. Better so, he thought. The whole thing, when accomplished, when he, Stoutenburg, was made master of Gelderland, the stadtholder a prisoner in his hands, the United Provinces ready to submit to him, would be a revelation to her, a revelation which would make her, he doubted not, a proud and happy woman, rather than a mere obedient slave. In the meanwhile, he had strictly enjoined Jen to leave the banqueting hall undisturbed. "Let the locked door and closed shutters guard the grim secret within," he said decisively. "Apparently, the Herr Burgomaster intends for the nonce to hold his tongue." In the hurry and excitement of the departure, the soldiers, who in the night had been roused by the pistol shot, forgot that unimportant event. Certain it is that not one of them did more than curiously wonder what it had been about. Then, as no one gave reply, the matter was soon allowed to fall into oblivion. At one moment, Stoutenburg, who was standing in the hall waiting for Gilda, felt tempted to go and have a last look on his dead enemy. But the key was not in the lock, and he would not send to the burgomaster for it. It was better so. Just then Gilda came down the stairs. She was accompanied by her old waiting woman, Maria, who was wrapped in fur cloak and hood ready for the journey. Apparently, she had taken final leave of her father, and had quite resigned herself to parting from him. "The burgomaster is well, I trust, this morning?" Stoutenburg asked with great urbanity, as soon as he had formally greeted her. "I thank you, my lord," she replied coolly. "My father is as well as I can desire." The litter was her own. Oft had she travelled in it between Haarlem and Amersfoort, when the weather was too rough for riding. Those had been happy journeys to and fro, for both homes were dear to her, but now had become hollowed through the presence in them of her beloved. To Stoutenburg, who watched her keenly while she crossed the hall, it seemed as if once she glanced round in the direction of a banqueting room and craned her neck, as if trying to catch whatever faint sound might be coming from there. She appeared to shiver, and drew her fur cloak closer round her shoulders. Her lips moved slightly, as if murmuring. Stoutenburg thought that she was bidding a last farewell to the man who she could not bring herself to forget or to despise, and an acute feeling of unbridled jealousy shot through him, like a poisoned dart, jealousy even of the dead. A mounted scout led the way, to clear the road of any encumbrance that might retard progress. After him came the standard beaver. 12 Spanish halberdiers followed, the shafts of their halberds swathed in black velvet, behind them 100 cavaliers, who were armed with muskets, and 100 more carrying lances. Then came the litter, which was covered in leather, which richly stamped leather curtains at the sides, the shafts, front and back, supported by heavy Flemish horses, which were sumptuously caparisoned and plumed. The Lord of Stoutenburg rode on one side of the litter, and Nocalis on the other, and behind it came 2 more companies of musketeers and lancers. The way through the Koppelpoort, and then straight across the Veluwe on the road which runs to the north of Amersfoort, thus avoiding any possible encounter with the stadtholder's vedettes. Stoutenburg's intention was to await Maurice of Nassau's coming at the Molen, not to offer him battle in the open. The road was lonely at this early hour, and a cutting wind blew across from the Zuider Zee, chasing the morning mist before it. Already on the horizon, above the undulating tableland, the pale, wintry sun tinged that mist with gold. Stoutenburg's keen, hawk-like eyes searched the distance before him as he rode. A little after 7 o'clock, Barneveld was reached, and a brief halt called outside the city, whilst the scouts went in search of provisions. The inhabitants, scared by the advent of these strangers, submitted to being fleeced of their goods, not daring to resist. Though closely questioned, they had but little information to impart. They had, in truth, heard that Ede was in the hands of the Spaniards, and that Amersfoort had shared the like fate. Runners had brought the news, which was authentic, together with many wild rumors that had terrorized the credulous and paved the way for Stoutenburg's arrival. His sable standard, with its grim device, completed the subjugation of the worthy burghers of Barneveld, who, with no garrison to protect them, thought it wisest to obey the behests of his magnificence with a show of goodwill, rather than see the little city pillaged or their citizens dragged as captives in the train of the conqueror. Gilda did not leave her litter during the halt. Maria, who had been riding on a pillion behind one of the equerries, whom she roundly trounced and anathematized all the way, came and waited on her mistress. But Stoutenburg and Nicoles kept with unwonted discretion, or mayhap indifference, out of her way. The halt, in truth, lasted less than a couple of hours. By 9 o'clock the troop was once more on the way, and an hour later, on the high upland, out toward the east, the lonely Molen loomed, portentous and weird, out of the mist. The spies of the stadtholder, who had, according to Diogenes' statement, spoken of the Molen as Stoutenburg's camp, where he had secreted great stores of arms and ammunition, had in truth been either deceived or deceivers. The Molen was lonely and uninhabited, as it had always been. No sign of life appeared around it, or sign of the recent breaking of a camp. True, here and there upon the scrub in the open, the scorched rough grass or a heap of ashes indicated that a fire had been lit there at one time, whilst under the overhanging platform the trampled earth converted into mud, and certain debris of straw and fodder accused the recent presence of horses and of men. But only a few. As to whether the stores of arms and ammunition were indeed concealed inside the mill-house itself was impossible to say from the mere aspect of the tumble-down building. Whatever secret the Molen contained, it had succeeded in guarding inviolate up to this hour. Standing as it did upon a high point of the arid upland, the Molen dominated the Veluwe. Toward the west, whence the stadtholder would come, a gentle, undulating slope led down to Barneveld and Ede, Amersfoort and Utrecht. But in the rear of the building, toward the east, the ground fell away more abruptly, down to a narrow gorge below. It was in this gorge, secluded from the prying eyes of possible vendettis, that Stoutenburg had put up his camp ere he embarked upon his fateful expedition to Amersfoort, and it was here that he disposed the bulk of his troop, horses, men, and baggage, under the command of Nicolaus Berestchen, whilst he himself, with a bodyguard of 50 picked men, took up his quarters in the Molen. The plan of action was simple enough. The 50 men would remain concealed in and about the building until the stadtholder, thinking the place deserted, walked straight into the trap that had been laid for him. Then, at the first musket shot, the men from the camp below were to rush up the sloping ground with a great clatter and much shouting and battle cry. The stadtholder's troops, wholly unprepared for the attack, would be thrown into dire confusion, and in the panic that would inevitably ensue, the rout would be complete. Stoutenburg himself would see to it that the stadtholder did not escape. "Welcome home, mine angel," had been his semi-ironical, wholly triumphant greeting to Gilda, when her litter came to a halt and he dismounted in order to conduct her into the Molen. She gave him no answer, but allowed her hand to rest in his and walked beside him with a firm step through the narrow door which gave on the interior of the mill-house. She looked about her with inquiring eyes that had not a vestige of terror in them. Almost, it seemed, at one moment as if she smiled. Did her memory conjure back just then the vision of that other Molen, the one at Ryswick, where so much had happened 3 short months ago, and where this arrogant tyrant had played such a sorry role? Perhaps. Certain it is that she turned to him without any defiance, almost with a gentle air of appeal. "I am very tired," she said, with a weary little sigh, "and would be grateful for a little privacy if your lordship would allow my tirewomen to attend on me." "Your wishes are my laws, mein Schat," he replied airily. "I entreat you to look on this somewhat dilapidated building only as a contemporary halt, where nothing, alas, can be done for your comfort. I trust you will not suffer from the cold, but absolute privacy you shall have. The loft up those narrow steps is entirely at your disposal, and your women shall come to you immediately." Indeed, he called at once through the door, and a moment or two later Maria appeared, reduced to silence for the nonce by a wholesome fear. Stoutenburg, in the meantime, still with that same ironical gallantry, had conducted Gilda to the narrow ladder-like steps which led up to the loft. He stood at the foot, watching her serene and leisurely progress. "How wise you are, mejuffrouw," he said with a sigh of satisfaction. "And withal, how desirable." She turned for a second, then, and looked down on him. But her eyes were quite inscrutable. Never had he desired her so much as now. With the gloomy background of those rickety walls behind her, she looked like an exquisite fairy, her dainty head wrapped in a hood, through which her small oval face appeared, slightly rose-tinted like a piece of delicate china. The huge fur coat concealed the lines of her graceful figure, but one perfect hand rested upon the rail, and the other peeped out like a flower between the folds of her cloak. He all but lost his head when he gazed on her, and met those blue eyes that still held a mystery for him. But with Stoutenburg, ambition and selfishness always waged successful warfare, even against passion, and at this hour his entire destiny was hanging in the balance. The look wherewith he regarded her was that of a conqueror rather than a lover. The title of the English play had come swiftly through his mind, The Taming of the Shrew. In truth, Nicolaus had been right. Women have no use for weaklings. It is their master whom they worship. Just one word of warning did he give her ere she finally passed out of his sight. "There will be noise of fighting anon, mine angel," he said carelessly. "Nothing that need alarm you. An encounter with vedettes, probably. A few musket shots. You will not be afraid?" "No," she replied simply. "I will not be afraid. You will be safe here with me until we can continue our journey east or south. It will depend on what progress de Burgh has been able to make." She gave a slight nod of understanding. "I shall be ready," she said. Encouraged by her gentleness, he went on more warmly. "And at the hour when we leave here together, mein Schat, a runner will speed to Amersfoort with order to Jan to evacuate the city. The burgomaster will be in a position to announce to his fellow citizens that they have nothing to fear from a chivalrous enemy, who will respect person and property, and who will go out of the gates of Amersfoort as empty-handed as he came." Whereupon he made her a low and respectful bow, stood aside to allow the serving woman to follow her mistress. Gilda had acknowledged his last pompous tirade with a faintly murmured, "I thank you, my lord." Then she went quickly up the steps and finally passed out of his sight on the floor above. Just for a little while he remained quite still, listening to her footsteps overhead. His lean, sharp-featured face expressed nothing but contentment now. Success complete, absolute, was his at last. Less than a fortnight ago, he was nothing but a disappointed vagrant, without home, kindred, or prospects, scorned by the woman he loved, despised by a successful rival, an outcast from the land of his birth. Today, his rival was dead, an object of contempt, not even of pity, for every honest man, while Gilda, like a ripe and luscious fruit, was ready to fall into his arms, and he had his foot firmly planted on the steps of a throne. And now the midday hour had gone by, and silence, absolute, reigned in and around the Molen. Stoutenburg had spent some time talking to the captain in command of his guard, had himself seen to it that the men were well concealed in the rear of the Molen. The horses had been sent down to the camp so as to preclude any possibility of an alarm being given before the apportioned time. 2 men were stationed on the platform to keep a lookout upon the distance, where anon the stadtholder and his troop would appear. Indeed, everything was ordained and arranged with perfect precision in anticipation of a great coup, which was destined to deliver Maurice of Nassau into the hands of his enemy. Everything, provided that blind informer who lay dead in the banqueting hall of the stately house at Amersfoort had not lied from first to last. But even if he had lied, even if the stadtholder had not planned this expedition, or having planned it, had abandoned it or given up the thought of leading it in person, even so, Stoutenburg was prepared to be satisfied. Already his busy brain was full of plans, which he would put into execution if the present one did not yield him to supreme prize. Gilda was his now, whatever happened. Gilda, and her wealth, and the influence of the burgomaster, Berestian, henceforth irrevocably tied to the chariot wheel of his son-in-law, a vista of riches, of honors, of power, which stretched out before the longing gaze of this restless and ambitious self-seeker. For the nonce, he could afford to wait, even though the hours crept by leaden-footed, and the lookout men up on the platform had nothing as yet to report. The soldiers outside, wrapped up in horse blankets, squatted against the walls of the dilapidated building, trying to get shelter from the cutting north wind. They had their provisions for the day requisitioned at Barneveld, but these they soon consumed for want of something better to do. The cold was better, and anon an icy drizzle began to fall. Stoutenburg, inside the mill house, had started on that restless pacing up and down which was so characteristic of him. He had ordered the best of the provisions to be taken up to the Jungfrau and her maid. He himself had eaten and had drunk, and now he had nothing to do but wait and think. Anon he got tired of both, and when he heard the women moving about overhead, he suddenly paused in his fretful wanderings, pondered for a moment or two, and then went resolutely up the stairs. Gilda was sitting on a pile of sacking. Her hands lay idly in her lap. With a curt word of command, Stoutenburg ordered the waiting woman to go below. Then he approached Gilda, and half kneeling, half reclining by her side, he tried to take her hand, but she evaded him, hid her hands underneath her cloak. This apparently vastly amused his lordship, for he laughed good-humouredly, and said with an ardent look of passionate admiration, "That is why you are so desirable, mine angel. Never twice the same. A while ago you seemed as yielding as a dove. Now, once more, I see the young vixen peeping at me through those wonderful blue eyes. Well," he added with a sigh of contentment, "I will not complain. Life by your side, mine Geliebte, will never be dull. The zest of taming a beautiful shrew must ever be a manly sport." Then, as she made no sign either of defiance or comprehension, but sat with eyes strained and her neck craned forward, almost as if she were listening, he raised himself and sat down upon the sacking close beside her. She puzzled him now, as she always did, and that puzzlement added zest to his wooing. "I was waxing so dejected down below," he said, and leaned forward, his lips almost touching the hood that kept her ears concealed. "Little did I guess that so much delight lay ready to my hand. Time is a hard taskmaster to me just now, and I have not the leisure to make as ardent love to you as I would wish. But I have the time to gratify a fancy, and this I will do. My fancy is to have 3 kisses from your sweet lips on mine, 3 and no more, and on the lips, mein Schat." In an instant his arms were round her, but equally suddenly she had evaded him. She jumped up and ran, as swift as a hare, to the farther end of the loft, where she remained ensconced behind a transverse beam, her arms round it for support, her face white and set, only vaguely discernible in the gloom. The dim afternoon light, which came by shyly peeping in through 2 small windows high up in the walls, failed to reach this angle of the loft where Gilda had found shelter. With this dim background behind her, she appeared like some elusive spectre, an apparition without form or substance, her face and hands alone visible. When she escaped him, Stoutenburg had cursed, as was his wont, then struggled to his feet and tried to carry off the situation with an affected laugh. But somehow the girl's face, there in the semi-darkness, gave him an unpleasant, eerie sensation. He did not follow her, but paused in the center of the loft, laughter dying upon his lips. "Am I to remind you again, you little termagant," he said, with a great show of bluster, "that Jan is still at Amersfoort, and that I may yet send a runner to him if I have a mind, ordering that by nightfall that accursed city be ablaze?" He was looking straight at her while he spoke, and she returned his glance, but gave him no reply. Just for the space of a few seconds, an extraordinary stillness appeared to have descended upon the Molen. Up here in the loft, nothing stirred. Nothing was heard above that silence, save the patter of the rain upon the roof overhead and against the tiny window panes. For a few seconds, Will Stoutenburg stood like a beast of prey about to spring, and Gilda, still and silent, like a bird on the alert. And suddenly, even as he gazed, the man's expression slowly underwent a change. First the arrogance died out of it, the forced irony. Every line became set, then rigid, and more eschewn in hue, until the whole face appeared like a death mask, colorless and transparent as wax, the jaw dropping, the lips parted as for a cry that would not come, and the sunken eyes opened wider and wider still as they gazed, not on Gilda any longer, but into the darkness behind her, whilst the whole aspect of the man was like a living statue of horror and of a nameless fear. Then suddenly, right through the silence and above the weird patter of the rain, there rang a sound which roused the very echoes that lay dormant among the ancient rafters. So strange a sound was it, that when it reached his ear, Stoutenburg lost his balance and swayed on his feet like a drunken man. So strange that Gilda, her nerves giving way for the first time under the terrible strain which she had undergone, buried her face against her arms, whilst a loud sob broke from her throat. Yet the sound in itself was neither terrifying nor a tragic tone. It was just the sound of a prolonged and loud peal of laughter. "By my halidam," a merry voice swore lustily, "but meseems that your lordship had no thought of seeing me here." Just for a few seconds, superstitious fear held the miscreant gripped by the throat. A few seconds? To him, to Gilda, they seemed an eternity. Then a hoarse whisper escaped him. "Spectre or demon, which are you?" "Both, you devil," the mocking voice gave reply, "and I would send you down to hell and shoot you like a dog where you stand, but for the noise which would bring your men about mine ears." "To hell yourself, you infamous Pleeshurk," Stoutenburg cried, strove to shake off with a mighty effort the superstitious dread that made a weakling of him. He fumbled for his sword, succeeding in drawing it from its scabbard, and cursed himself for being without a pistol in his belt. "Where you came from I know not," he went on in a husky whisper, "but be you wraith or demon, you—" He seemed to speak involuntarily, as if sheer terror was forcing the words through his bloodless lips. Suddenly he uttered a hoarse cry. "Amoy! Somebody there? Amoy!" But the walls of the old Molen were thick, and his voice spent and half choked with the horror of that spectral apparition, refused him effective service. It failed to carry far enough. The tiny windows were impracticable. The soldiers were outside at the rear of the building, out of earshot, and down below there was only the old waiting woman. "That smearlap," he cried, half to himself, "either a wraith or blind, in either case," and sword in hand he rushed upon his mocking enemy. A blind man? Bah! What had he to fear? The rogue had in truth thrust Gilda behind him. He stood there, with one of those short English daggers in his hand, which had of late put the fine Toledo blades to shame, but a blind man for all that. How he had escaped out of Amersfoort, and by whose connivance, Stoutenburg had not time to think. But the man was blind. Every phase of last evening's interview with him, the vacant eyes, the awkward moments, stood out clearly before his lordship's mental vision, and testified to that one fact. The man was blind and helpless. Crouching like a feline creature upon his haunches, Stoutenburg was ready for a spring. His every movement became lithe and silent as that of a snake. He had marked out to himself just how and where he would strike. He only waited until those awful eyes, ceased to look on him. But their glance never wavered. They followed his every step. They mocked and derided and threatened withal. But Satan and all his hordes, those stricken orbs, could see. At what precise moment that conviction entered Stoutenburg's tortured brain, he could not himself have told you. But suddenly it was there, and in an instant his nerve completely forsook him. An icy sweat broke all over his body. His head swam. His knees gave way under him. The sword dropped out of his nerveless hand. Then, with a quick, hoarse cry, he turned to flee. His foot was on the top step of the ladder which led to the room below. A prolonged, mocking laugh behind him seemed to lend him wings. But freedom, aye, and more, beckoned from below. There was only an old woman there, and his soldiers were outside. Ye gods, he was a fool to fear. He flew down the few steps, nearly fell headlong in the act, for his nerves were playing him an unpleasant trick, and the afternoon light was growing dim. At first, when he reached the place below, he saw nothing save the welcome door, straight before him, which led straight to freedom from this paralyzing obsession. With one bound, he had covered half the intervening space, when suddenly he paused, and an awful curse rose to his lips. There, in the recess of the doorway, two men were squatting on their heels, intent upon a game of hazard. One of these men was long and lean, the other round as a curled-up hedgehog. They did no more than glance over their shoulder when His Magnificence, the Lord of Stoutenburg, came staggering down the steps. 5 and 4, the lean vagabond was saying. How many does that make? 8, you loon, the other replied. My turn now. They continued their game, regardless of his lordship, who stood there rooted to the spot, trembling in every limb, his body covered with sweat, feeling like an animal that sees a trap slowly closing in upon him. The situation was indeed one to send a man out of his senses. Stoutenburg, for a brief instant, felt that he was going mad. He looked from the door to the steps, and back again to the door, marveling which way lay his one chance of escape. If he shouted, would he be heard? Could his men get to him before those two ruffians fell to and murdered him? Dared he make a dash for the door? Or it was unthinkable that he, Stoutenburg, should be standing here, at the mercy of 3 villains, utterly powerless, when outside, not 50 paces away, the other side of those walls, 50 men at arms were there, set to guard his person. And suddenly fear fell away from him. The trembling of his limbs ceased. His vision became clear, his mind alert. Even around his quaking lips there came the ghost of a smile. His senses, keyed up by the imminence of his danger, had seized upon a sound which came from outside, faint as yet, but very obviously drawing near. In the semi-darkness, and with his head buzzing and his nerves tingling, he could not distinguish either the quality of the sound, nor yet the exact direction whence it came. But whatever it was, even if it was not all that he hoped, The sound was bound to set his soldiers on the alert, and if he could only temporize with those ruffians for a minute or two, the very next would see the captain of his guard rushing in to report what was happening. The stadtholder sighed. The signal given. Nicolaus Berestchen coming swiftly to the rescue. Therefore, in the face of his own imminent peril, the Lord of Stoutenburg no longer felt afraid, only tensely, vitally expectant. The two caitiffs, on the other hand, appeared to have heard nothing. At any rate, they went on with their game, and the flute-like, high-pitched tones of the fat loon alternated with the deep bass of his companion. 3 and 2 make 5. No, 4, you varlet. 6. Blank by Beelzebub. My luck is dead out today. And the sound drew near. There was no mistaking it. Men running. The clatter of arms. Horses too. A pawing and a champing and a general hubbub, which those two ruffians could not fail to hear. Nor did any sound come down from the left. Yet Gilda was there with the miserable Pleschurk, who, whatever else happened, would inevitably stand before her now as an informer and a cheat. This, at any rate, was a fact. The man had betrayed his master in order to save his miserable life, and the burgomaster had connived at his escape through the excess of doltish weakness. But the fact remained. The stadtholder was approaching. The next few minutes, second, perhaps, would see the final triumphant issue of this terrible adventure. Stoutenburg, like a feline at bay, waited. Then, all at once, a musket shot rang through the air. Then another, and yet another. And all at once the whole air around was alive with sounds. The clang of arms, the lusty battle cries. Men out there had come to grips. In the drenching rain, they were at one another's throats. The two caitiffs quietly put aside their dice and rose to their feet. They stood with their backs to the door, their eyes fixed upon his lordship. "Stand aside, you dolts," Stoutenburg cried aloud, for he thought that he read murder in those two pairs of eyes, and he had need of all his nerves to assure himself that all was well, that, though his captain had not come to him for a reason which no doubt was sound, his soldiers were at grips with the stadtholder's vanguard, and Nicolaus was already halfway up the slope. But he, Stoutenburg, was unarmed, and could not push past those two assassins who were guarding the door. He bethought himself of his sword, which lay on the floor of the loft. He turned with a sudden impulse to get hold of it at all costs, and was met at the very foot of the steps by the man who had baffled him at every turn. Diogenes, sword in hand, did not even pause to look on his impotent enemy. With one spring, he was across the floor and out by the door, which one of the ruffians immediately closed behind him. It had all happened swifter even than thought. Stoutenburg, trapped, helpless, more bewildered in truth than terrified, still believed in a happy issue to his present desperate position. The thought came to him that he might purchase his safety from those potential murderers. 10,000 guilders, he called out wildly, if you will let me pass. But the fat ruffian merely turned to the lean one, and the look of understanding which passed between them sent an icy shudder down his lordship's spine. He knew that from these two he could expect no mercy. A hoarse cry of horror escaped his lips as he saw that each held a dagger in one hand. Then began that awful chase, when man becomes a hunted beast, that grim game of hide-and-seek, with the last issue never once in doubt. The Lord of Stoutenburg, trapped between those narrow walls, ran round and round like a mouse in a cage, now seeking refuge behind a girder, now leaping over an intervening obstacle, now crouching, panting and bathed in sweat, under cover of the gloom. And no one spoke, no one called. Neither the hunted, not the hunters. It seemed as if a conspiracy of silence existed between them, or else that the nearness of death had put a seal on all their lips. Over there the clang of battle appeared more remote. Nothing seemed to occur in the immediate approach of the Molen. It all came from afar, resounding across the Veluwe, above the patter of the rain and the soughing of the wind, through the rafters of the old mill. Drumming and thumping, the angle of armor, the clang of pike and lance, of metal, the loud report of musket shot, the strident grating of chains and wheels, but all far away, not here, not outside the Molen, but down there in the gorge, where Nicolaus had been encamped. My heavens, what did it mean? Already the trapped creature was getting exhausted. Once or twice he had come down on his knees. His eyes were growing dim. His breath came and went with a wheezing sound from his breast. It was not just two murderous brigands who were pursuing him, but Nemesis herself, with sword of retribution drawn, in her hand an hourglass, the sands of which were running low. All at once the miscreant found himself at the foot of the steps, and, blindly stumbling, he ran up to the loft, instinctively, without set purpose save that of a warding off, if only for a minute, the inevitable end. Gilda was standing at the top of the steps, with neck craned forward, her hands held tightly to her breast, her whole attitude one of nameless horror. She had been listening to the multifarious sounds which came from outside, and the natural womanly fear for the safety of her beloved had been her one dominant emotion. She had heard nothing else for a time, until suddenly she caught one or two stray sounds of that grim and furtive fight for life which was going on down below. She had reached the top of the steps, and tried to peer through the gloom to ascertain whose were the stealthy, swift footfalls so like those of a hunted beast, and whose the heavy, lumbering tread that spoke of stern and unwavering pursuit. At first she could see nothing, and the very silence which lay like a pall upon the grim scene below struck her with a sense of paralyzing dread. Then she caught sight first of one figure, then of another, as they crossed her line of vision. She could distinguish nothing very clearly, just those swiftly moving figures, and for a moment or two felt herself unable to move. Then she heard the labored breathing of a man, a groan as of a soul tortured with fear, and the next instant the Lord of Stoutenburg appeared, stumbling up the narrow steps. At sight of her he fell like an inert thing with a husky cry at her feet. His arms encircled her knees. His head fell against her gown. "Gilda, save me," he whispered hoarsely. "For the love of heaven, they'll murder me. Save me for pity's sake. Gilda!" He sobbed and cried like a child, abject in his terror, loathsome in his craven cowardice. Gilda could not stir. He held her with his arms as in a vice. She would have given worlds for the physical strength to wrench her gown out of his clutch, to flee from the hatred sight of him who had planned to do her beloved such an irreparable injury. Oh, she hated him. She hated him worse, perhaps, than she had ever done before, now that he clung like a miserable dastard to her for mercy. Leave the poltroon to us, mejuffrouw. A gentle, flute-like tone broke in on the miscreant's ravings. Now then, take your punishment like a man, a gruff voice added sternly. And two familiar faces emerged out of the gloom, immediately below where Gilda was standing, imprisoned by those cringing arms. The man, in truth, had not even the premial pluck of a savage. He was beaten, and he knew it. What had happened out there on the Veluwe, how completely he had been tricked by the Englishmen, he did not know as yet. But he was afraid to die, and shrank neither from humiliation nor contempt in order to save his own worthless life from the wreck of all his ambitions. At the sound of those two voices, which in truth were like a death knell in his ears, he jumped to his feet, but he did not loosen his hold on Gilda. Swift as thought, he had found refuge behind her, and held her by the arms in front of him like a shield. Historians have always spoken of the Lord of Stoutenburg as extraordinarily nimble in mind and body. That nimbleness, in truth, stood him in good stead now, or will Socrates or Pythagoras, clumsily in their movements, lumbering and hampered by their respect for the person of the jongejuffrouw, reached the loft, and then for the instant hesitated how best to proceed in their grim task without offering the ears and eyes of the great lady. Stoutenburg had with one bound slipped from behind her down the steps, and was across the floor of the Molen and out of the door before the two worthies had had time to utter the comprehensive curse which, at this unexpected maneuver on the part of their quarry, had risen to their lips. We had promised Diogenes not to allow the blackguard to escape, Pythagoras exclaimed ruefully, and both started in hot pursuit, whilst Gilda, seeking shelter in a dark angle of the loft, fell sobbing with excitement and only half-conscious upon a pile of sacking. End of chapter 15. Read by Elijah Fisher.
Chapter 16 of the First Sir Percy. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Christine Rottger. The First Sir Percy by Baroness Orczy. Chapter 16. The Final Issue. Part 1. Pythagoras and Socrates failed to find the trail of the miscreant who had vanished under the cover of the night. We know that Stoutenburg did succeed, in fact, in reaching de Burgh's encampment, half-starved and wearied, but safe. How he did it, no one will ever know. His career of crime had received a mighty check, and the marauding expeditions which he undertook subsequently against his own country were of futile and desultory nature. History ceases to trouble herself about him after that abortive incursion into Gelderland. How that incursion was frustrated by the gallant Englishman, known to fame as the First Sir Percy Blake, but to his intimates as Diogenes, the erstwhile penniless soldier of fortune, we know chiefly through a vent einsamer Saken von Stadt. The worthy chronicler enlarges upon the Englishman's adventure. He always calls him the Englishman. From the time when a week and more ago he took leave of Nicolaes Berenstain, outside Barneveld, to that when he reached Amershott, just in time to avert a terrible catastrophe. The offer of Saken Verstadt tells of the ambuscade on the shores of the Idsel. The Englishmen swim for life through the drifting floes. On reaching the opposite bank, it seemed that he was so spent and more than half frozen, that he lay half unconscious on the bank for a while. Presently, however, alive to the danger of possible further ambuscades, he restarted on his way, found a deserted hut close by, and crawled in there for shelter. As soon as darkness had set in, he started back for Zutphen, there to warn Marquette not to proceed. The whole of the stadtholder's plans had obviously been revealed to de Burgh by some traitor, whose identity Diogenes then could not fail but guess, and it would have been sheer madness to attempt to cross the Ichsel now at any of the points originally intended. To reach Zutphen at this juncture meant for the undaunted adventurer 2 leagues and more to traverse, and with clothes frozen hard to the skin. But he did reach Zutphen in time, and with the assistance of Marquette, then evolved the plan of an advance into Gelderland by effecting the crossing of the Ichsel as far north as Apeldoorn, and then striking across the Veluwe, either to Amersfoort or Ede, threatening de Burgh's advance and possibly effecting a junction with the stadtholder's main army. After this understanding with Marquette, Diogenes then proceeded to Arnheim, where the garrison could now only be warned to hold the city at all costs until assistance could be sent. In the meantime, de Burgh's troops were swarming everywhere. The Englishman could only proceed by night, had to hide by day on the Veluwe as best he could. Hence much delay. More than once he was on the point of capture, but succeeded eventually in reaching Arnheim. Here he saw Korn, who was in command of the small garrison, assured him of coming relief, and made him swear not to surrender the city, since the stadtholder would soon be on his way with strong reinforcements. Thence to Nijmegen on the same errand. A more easy journey this, seeing that Isenburg had not begun his advance from Cleve. After that, to Kersur and Vargen again. Van Etzema said that it was between Nijmegen and Vargen again that the Englishman, lurking in a thicket of scrub, overheard some talk of how the stadtholder was to be waylaid and captured on his return to camp from Amersfoort. This fact the chronicler must have learned at first hand. By this time the forces of de Burgh were spreading over Gelderland. The Englishman gathered that the Archduchess's plans were to leave Isenburg's army to deal with Arnheim and Nijmegen for the present, whilst de Burgh was to march on to Ede, and if possible push on as far as Amersfoort. But as to how the coup against Stadtholder was to be effected, he could not ascertain. At the time he did not know that His Highness intended to visit Amersfoort again, but for him that little city where Gilda dwelt was just now the hub of the universe, and thank heaven his errand was now accomplished, all His Highness's orders executed, and he was free to go to his young wife as fast as his own endurance and Spanish vendettes would allow. This meant another tramp across open country, which by this time was overrun with enemy troops. Fugitives from the Ede were everywhere to be seen. "The Spaniards, they are on us!" rang from end to end of the invaded province, and the echo of that dismal cry must by now have been rolling even as far as Utrecht. It meant also seeking cover against enemy surprise parties, who threw the daring adventurer more than once out of his course, so that we hear of him once as far south as Rennen, and then as far east as Doorn. It meant hiding amongst the reeds in the half-frozen marshes, swimming the Rhin at one point and the Em at another. It meant days without food and nights without rest. It meant all that and more in pluck and endurance and determination, to which 3 qualities in the Englishman, the worthy chronicler, though ever chary of words, pays ungrudging tribute. He reached Amersfoort, as we know, just in time to see the stadtholder leave the city in the company of the traitor, Nicholas Berestein, and, struck by that same treacherous hand, fell helpless for a moment at the very threshold of the burgomaster's house. After which began the martyrdom which had ended in such perfect triumph and happiness. The daring adventurer, left lonely and stricken upon the moorland, did in truth go through an agony of misery and humiliation such as seldom falls to the lot of any man. Indeed, what he did suffer throughout that terrible day, whilst he believed himself to be unretrievably blinded, was never known to anyone save the 2 faithful friends who watched lovingly over him. Socrates, after he had accompanied the stadtholder, returned to sit and watch with Pythagoras beside the man to whom they both clung with such wholehearted devotion. Part 2. It was not until late in the night that a faint glimmer of light, coming from the fire which the 2 caitiffs had managed to kindle as the night was bitterly cold, reached the young soldier's aching limbs, and seemed to him like a tiny beacon of hope in the blackness of his misery. By the time that the grey dawn broke over the moorland, he had realized that the injury which he had thought irremediable had only been transient, and that every hour now brought an improvement in his power of vision, whereupon 3 heads were put together to devise a means for using the Englishman's supposed blindness to the best advantage. 1 wise head and 2 loyal ones, not one of them even remotely acquainted with fear. What finer combination could be found for the eventful undoing of a pack of traitors? Ide was in the hands of the Spaniards, Amersfoort on the point of sharing the like fate. These facts were sufficiently confirmed by the stray fugitives who wandered homeless and distracted across the moorland, and were in turn interrogated by the 3 conspirators. With the woman he loved inside the invaded city, and with that recreant Stoutenburg in command of the enemy troops there, Diogenes' first thought was to get into Amersfoort himself at all risks and costs. As for the plan for freeing the town and punishing the miscreants, it was simple enough. To collect a small troop of ruffians from amongst the fugitives on the moorlands and place these under the command of Socrates was the first move. The second was to send Pythagoras with an urgent message to Marquette to hurry eastward with his army from Apeldoorn to the relief of Amersfoort, taking on his way the lonely Molen on the Veluwe, where an important detachment of enemy troops might be expected to encamp. The one thing with which Diogenes was, most fortunately, amply provided was money which he had by him when first he started out of Amersfoort on the stadtholder's errand. Money which was needful now to enable Socrates to recruit his small army of ne'er-do-wells and to assist Pythagoras on his embassy to Marquette. Thereafter Diogenes, feigning blindness and worse, made his way into the presence of the Lord of Stoutenburg, who held Gilda at his mercy and the whole city to ransom for her obedience. To dangle before the miscreant's eyes the prospect of capturing the stadtholder's person, and thus make himself master of the Netherlands, was the pivot around which the whole plan revolved. The bait could not fail to attract the ambitious cupidity of the traitor. The verisimilitude was given to the story by Socrates' band of ruffians, whose orders were to spread the news of the stadtholder's advance both on Ide and Amersfoort, and to silence effectually any emissaries of Stoutenburg's who might be sent out to ascertain the truth of those rumors. We may take it that Socrates and his little troop saw to it that none of these emissaries did return to Amersfoort, For the Lord of Stoutenburg marched out of the city at dawn, with his sinister banner flying, with his musketeers, pikemen, and lancers, and with Gilda Berenstain, a virtual prisoner in his train. That the daring adventurer risked an ignominious death by this carefully laid plan cannot be denied. But he was one of those men who had gambled with life and death since he was a child, who was accustomed to stake his all upon the spin of a coin, and anyhow, if he failed, death would have been thrice welcome, as the only escape out of untold misery and sorrow. Chance favored him in this, that at the last he was left face to face with the burgomaster, to whom he immediately confided everything, and who enabled him to escape out of the house by the service staircase, and thence into the streets, where no one knew him, and where he remained all night, effectually concealed as a unit in the midst of the crowd. He actually went out of Amersfoort in the train of Stoutenburg, and whilst his lordship's troops made a long halt at Barneveld, the Englishman continued his way unmolested across the Veluwe to the lonely Molen, which was to witness his success and happiness, or the final annihilation of all that made life possible. Part 3. All this and more in the matter of detail hath the meticulous chronicler of the time put conscientiously on record. We must assume that he was able to verify all his facts at source, chiefly through the garrulous offices of the Englishman's two well-known familiars. What, however, will forever remain unrecorded, save in the book of heroic deeds, is a woman's perfect loyalty. During those hours and days full of horror and of dread, Gilda never once wavered in her belief in the man she loved. From the moment when Nicholas tried to poison her mind against him, and through all the vicissitudes which placed her face to face with what was a mere semblance of her beloved, she had never doubted him, even when the stadtholder seemed to doubt. She knew him to be playing a dangerous game, but a game for all that. When first she beheld him, sightless and abject, in the presence of their mutual enemy, and had rested for one brief second against his breast, that his eyes, still dazed by the poisonous fumes, could vaguely discern her face, even though they could not read the expression thereon, she did not know. The fear that he was irremediably blinded was the most cruel of all the tortures which she had undergone that night. When her father came to her in the small hours of the morning to tell her that all was well with the beloved of her heart, but that he would have all the need of all her courage and all of her determination to help him complete his self-imposed task, she realized for the first time how near to actual death the torturing fear had brought her. But from that time forth she never lost her presence of mind. With marvelous courage she gripped the whole situation and played her role unswervingly until the end. Everything depended on whether Marquette reached the Molen before the Lord of Stoutenburg, or his captain suspected that anything was wrong. True, Pythagoras had brought back the news that he had met the loyal commander at Apeldoorn, and that the latter, despite the fact that he and his troops intended to take there a well-earned rest, had immediately given the order to march. But even so, the future of the Netherlands and of her stadtholder, as well as the fate of the gallant Englishman and his beloved wife, lay in the hands of God. 1 hour before dusk, Marquette's vedettes first came in contact with the outposts of Berenstain's encampment in the gorge below the Molen. There was a brief struggle, fierce on both sides, until the main body of Marquette's army, 4,000 strong, appeared on the eastern heights above the gorge. whilst the Lord of Stoutenburg ran round and round the narrow space wherein he was a hunted prisoner, trying to escape that shameful death which threatened him at the hand of 2 humble justiciaries. His few hundred men were falling like butchered beasts beneath the pike thrusts and musket shots of Marquette's trained troops. Nicholas Berenstain was the first to fall. It was better so. Dishonor so complete could be only wiped out by death. When, a day or 2 later, after Marquette had driven the Spaniards out of Amersfoort, the burgomaster heard the news of the death of his only son, he murmured a humble and broken-hearted "Thank God." End of chapter 16.
Chapter 17 of the First Sir Percy. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Stacey M. The First Sir Percy by Baroness Orczy. Chapter 17. The Only World. Out there in the lonely Molen on the Veluwe, Gilda had remained for a while, half numb with nerve strain, suffering from reaction after the terrible excitement of the past few hours. Presently her old serving woman came to her, still raging with choler at the outrage committed against her person by those 2 abominable rascallions. With great volubility she explained to her mistress that they had fallen on her unawares, when first she had been sent downstairs by his lordship, whom may God punish. They had bound and gagged her, and then told her quite cheerfully that this was an act of friendship on their part, to save her from a worse fate, and from the temptation of talking when she should remain silent. She had been thrust into a dark angle of the mill-house, from whence she could see absolutely nothing, and where she had lain all this while, entirely helpless, hearing that awful din which had been going on outside, expecting to be murdered in cold blood at any moment, and tortured with fear as to what was happening to her mistress. Only a few moments ago, the 2 ruffians had reappeared, running helter-skelter down the steps, and thence out through the door into the open. Fortunately, one of them, conscience-stricken no doubt, had thought, before fleeing, to release her from her bonds. Maria was stupid, uncomprehending, and garrulous, but she was loyal, and had a warm and ample bosom, whereon a tired and aching head could find a little rest. Gilda, her body still shaken by hysterical sobs, her teeth chattering, her senses reeling with the horror of all that she had gone through, found some measure of comfort in the old woman's ministrations. A mugful of wine, left over from the midday meal, helped her to regain command over her nerves. Holding her young mistress in her arms, Maria, crooning like a mother over her baby, rocked the half-inert young form into some semblance of sleep. And here Diogenes found her a couple of hours later, curled up like a tired child in the arms of the old woman. He came up on tiptoe, carrying a lantern, for now it was quite dark. This he placed on the floor, and then, with infinite caution, he slid into Maria's place and took the beloved form into his own strong arms. She scarcely moved, just opened her eyes for a second or 2, and then nestled closer against his shoulder, with a little sigh, half of weariness, but wholly of content. She was just dead tired after all she had gone through, and now she slept just like a baby in his arms, while he was as happy as it is possible for any human being to be, for she was safe and well, and nothing could part her from him now. He was satisfied to watch her as she slept, her dear face against his breast, her soft breath coming and going with perfect evenness through her parted lips. Once he stooped and kissed her, and then she woke, put her arms around his neck, and both forgot for the time being that there was another world save that of love. End of chapter 17. End of the First Sir Percy by Baroness Orczy.